I was working under a name my own family didn't know when I saw a homeless girl outside a grocery store, a baby strapped against her chest. "Please," she whispered, "just feed my brother. I can stay hungry." I followed her away from the cameras, reached for the formula, and saw her face. My daughter. Every instinct screamed her name. I swallowed it. If I exposed who I was, I could lead danger straight to her. I gave her one card, walked away, and counted the 72 hours until I could come home. Before I tell you how my family got us there, I hope you're doing okay wherever you're listening from. Stay with me to the end, and if stories like this mean something to you, I'd be glad to have you subscribe to the channel. 12 days before I saw Emma outside that grocery store. She was standing barefoot in our kitchen with a piece of toast in one hand and my phone in the other, taking photographic evidence of her father losing an argument with a 6-month-old baby. It was Monday, the 4th of May 2026, the morning I was supposed to leave for what my family believed was an overseas compliance audit. Noah had been awake since a little after 5. By 6, Adrian had reached the dangerous stage of parental confidence that only appears when someone has already failed 3 times, but still believes the 4th attempt will prove a theory. He had walked Noah around the kitchen, bounced him against his shoulder, checked the diaper twice, lowered the blinds as though sunlight itself had personally offended our son, and finally announced that he could have him asleep in 5 minutes if everyone would stop interfering. 15 minutes later, Noah was wide awake in his crib, examining his own fingers with great seriousness. Adrian was asleep on the rug beside him. Emma had found them that way. By the time I came downstairs, she had already taken the picture and added the score in the Notes app on my phone. No. 1. Dad. 0. I leaned against the kitchen counter with my coffee and looked at the image longer than I needed to. Adrian was on his side, one arm folded beneath his head, his dark hair standing up at the back. Noah's face appeared between the crib slats above him, round-eyed and delighted by whatever mysterious victory he believed he had achieved. There was nothing staged about it. No one was trying to be a good father for a photograph. Adrian was simply exhausted because our son had decided sleep was a rumor. That mattered to me later. When a marriage breaks badly enough, memory becomes dangerous. It is tempting to repaint everything that came before in darker colors, so the ending makes more sense. I could have told myself Adrian had always been cold, always been controlling, always been waiting for a chance to hurt me. It would have made what happened easier to explain. It also would not have been true. He had been the man who learned how Emma liked her grilled cheese cut when she was 4, because apparently triangles tasted better than rectangles. He had sat cross-legged beside her bed when she had nightmares in elementary school. When Noah was born the previous November, Adrian had taken every diaper change after midnight for the first 2 weeks, because I was recovering and feeding the baby already felt like a job without closing hours. There had been nights when I woke to find him pacing the hall in the dark, Noah against his chest, whispering nonsense because he thought the rhythm of his own voice might settle him. People do not always become dangerous because they never loved you. Sometimes love is real, and so is resentment. The trouble begins when one person decides love gives them the right to reshape the other. I did not know that yet. That morning, I only knew my coffee was getting cold. Noah had defeated a grown man before breakfast, and Emma had taken possession of half the dining table with school books, while supposedly getting ready for class. At 14, she had perfected the ability to look busy while doing 3 unrelated things at once. Her algebra worksheet sat beneath a hairbrush. One earbud was in. A bowl of cereal had been abandoned near the edge of the table, close enough to a stack of papers that I moved it without thinking. Emma noticed. She always noticed when I did that. I had spent the previous evening printing schedules, confirming pickup permissions, checking Noah's pediatric contact information, labeling the frozen milk in the downstairs freezer, and creating a list for Adrian that was so detailed, even I had begun to suspect it was excessive. The pages were clipped neatly inside a thin binder on the counter. Emma picked it up, and flipped through it with the grave expression of someone reviewing a disaster response protocol. "Mom's apocalypse plan," she said. I told her civilization had survived, as long as it had, because someone made lists. She glanced at the 3 pages in her hand, then at the extra copy I had placed beside Adrian's keys. "So this is what happens right before civilization ends." That earned a sleepy sound from Adrian in the doorway. He had recovered enough from Noah's victory to stand, though not enough to button his shirt correctly on the first attempt. Emma pointed that out without mercy. For a few minutes, the kitchen was the same chaotic little country. It had always been Noah banging a silicone spoon against his tray, Emma moving faster, only after I reminded her of the time, Adrian pretending he had meant to skip a button, me checking the clock while trying not to check it too obviously. I remember those minutes, because nothing about them felt precious then. Normal life rarely announces itself before it disappears. The assignment had come 4 days earlier. I could not tell my family what it actually involved. As far as they were concerned, I was a senior risk and compliance consultant for an international logistics company, which was not a flimsy invented title I pulled out whenever I needed to leave town. I had an office, email, salary, supervisors, conference calls, travel reimbursements, and more compliance documents than Emma's jokes about my career could ever exaggerate. Most of the work attached to that identity was real enough that the boundary between what I could discuss and what I could not had become an ordinary feature of our marriage. The explanation I gave Adrian was simple. A client needed an audit handled overseas. I would leave May 4 and was expected back Tuesday, May 19. Contact would be limited for portions of the assignment. He had heard versions of that before. What was different was Noah. Our son was 6 months old, and Adrian had convinced himself during my pregnancy that his birth would mark some kind of natural end to the part of my work he disliked. We had never made a formal agreement. I had told Adrian that after Noah was born, I wanted to reassess how much travel I accepted, and I meant it. In Adrian's memory, that intention had slowly hardened into something closer to a promise. When I told him about the May assignment, he did not shout. He did not tell me I was forbidden to go. He stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing a bottle, water running over his fingers long after the milk residue had disappeared. His shoulders changed before his face did. I thought things would be different after Noah. He said it quietly enough that I could have pretended not to hear the accusation beneath the disappointment. Instead, I crossed the room and rested my hand between his shoulder blades. I reminded him that I had already turned down one assignment in March and that I would be home on the 19th. The schedule was covered. Childcare was covered. My parents lived less than 20 minutes away and had volunteered to help. Emma was old enough to tell us when something was wrong, and young enough that I still checked whether she had remembered lunch. I gave Adrian solutions, because solutions were what I knew how to give. What I did not give him was an answer to the question he was really asking. How much of me would always belong to something he could not see? That question followed us to my parents' house the night before I left. My father, Thomas Reed, had never liked the phrase client confidentiality. To him, it sounded like the corporate version of refusing to answer a direct question. He was 64 then, recently retired from a career that had rewarded certainty and hierarchy. My father liked knowing where people stood. He liked plans with names attached to them, explanations with beginnings and endings, and family problems that could be solved by putting everyone around the same table until somebody admitted who was wrong. My work violated almost every one of those preferences. Dinner itself was ordinary. Helen had made too much food, as she always did, and kept trying to send half of it home with us, because she believed leftovers were a form of maternal insurance. Noah sat in a portable high chair between Adrian and me, mostly interested in the edge of his bib. Emma told my mother about a teacher who had assigned a group project, and then seemed surprised that teenagers did not become efficient project managers, simply because they had been placed in groups. For a while, the evening was warm. Then, my father asked where I would be staying. I gave him the same answer I always gave when the answer belonged inside the boundary of my work. I could not share the client location. He looked at Adrian instead of me. The gesture was small. That was why it stayed with me. It implied that the real person being denied information was my husband, and that the real question was why he tolerated it. My mother tried to soften the moment. She said she knew work could be complicated, but then she drifted into an old story about a position she had once been offered when I was little. The job would have required travel. She had turned it down. She did not tell the story bitterly. Helen almost never sounded bitter about sacrifice. That was part of what made her beliefs so difficult to recognize as pressure. She had spent years transforming every door she had closed into evidence that she had made the right choice. By the time dessert was cleared, the message sat between us without needing to be spoken plainly. Mothers sometimes gave things up because that was what mothers did. Emma had been quiet for several minutes. I saw her watching me across the table, not frightened, only alert. At 14, she understood tone better than adults like to admit. She knew when a question was not really a question. She knew when my mother's old career story had stopped being about Helen. On the drive home, Emma did not mention it. Neither did I. That omission would bother me later too. There were many things I postponed because I believed time was waiting for us. The next morning, I went through the practical details with Adrian one final time. Emma's school schedule and pickup permissions were current. Our regular childcare covered Adrian's work hours. My parents were backup, and Noah's medical information and household expenses were already handled. I also slipped an employee family crisis resource card into my wallet, the kind of backup I carried and rarely thought about. Then I showed Adrian the corporate emergency number. It was not a direct line to me. It existed so that family could reach the organization supporting my cover employment if something genuinely serious happened while I was unavailable. The person answering could not casually patch Adrian through or tell him where I was. But if there was a real family emergency, there was a process. I made him save it in his phone. I wrote it on the printed plan anyway. Emma, watching me from the table, tapped the binder. Apocalypse. I told her she would thank me when the zombies came. She rolled her eyes in exactly the way I had hoped she would. That tiny expression, more than the joke, told me the strange heaviness from dinner had not followed her home as deeply as I feared. At least I believed that then. She left for school shortly afterward. Before she reached the front door, I reminded her I would be gone before she got home. She came back, wrapped her arms around my waist with the sudden awkward force teenagers sometimes use when affection catches them before self-consciousness can intervene, and stayed there longer than expected. When she stepped away, she picked at a loose thread near the pocket of her hoodie. "You're coming back on the 19th, right?" There was nothing dramatic in her voice. She wanted the date confirmed because dates were measurable. A trip ending soon meant nothing to a 14-year-old. Tuesday the 19th meant she could count backward. I told her yes. The assignment could always change around the edges, but that was my scheduled return, and if anything significant changed, the family would be notified through the proper channel. She accepted that. Emma did not ask whether I loved her. She did not ask whether my work mattered more than she did. Those were adult questions that would later be put into her mouth by adults who needed her to choose between things she had never believed were competing. She simply believed I was coming home. After the front door closed behind her, the house became strangely quiet. Noah had finally surrendered to a nap. His monitor gave off its faint electronic hiss from the counter. Sunlight reached across the kitchen floor, stopping just short of the emergency binder Emma had mocked. Adrian stood near the island with my travel bag beside him. He had checked my itinerary again that morning. The version available to him showed the cover travel information and the expected return date. It did not show the operational details beneath it. He had lived with that distinction for years, but something about this trip had made the old arrangement feel newly intolerable. He asked where I would actually be. Not the corporate answer, not the region listed in the paperwork. Where would I really be? There were limits I could not move, simply because the person asking was my husband. I told him the truth available to me. There were things I was legally not permitted to discuss. His fingers remained wrapped around the handle of my suitcase. You're always allowed to leave. I'm just never allowed to ask. That sentence stayed behind after he carried the bag to the car. At the time, I heard pain in it. I still think the pain was real. What I failed to hear was entitlement beginning to grow around the pain, the belief that, because secrecy hurt him, I owed him the removal of every boundary that caused it. I kissed Noah before I left. He smelled faintly of baby shampoo and warm milk. I stood over his crib longer than necessary, one hand resting against the rail while he slept with both fists near his face. On the dresser beside me was a framed picture of Emma, holding him the week we brought him home, her expression somewhere between awe and terror at being trusted with something so small. I checked my watch, then checked it again. Planning had always made leaving easier. Plans let me pretend absence was an engineering problem. If the right people had the right numbers, if there was backup childcare, if the freezer was stocked, if the calendar was clear, then love could survive distance without becoming danger. I believed that because it had been true before. Adrian drove me to the point where my cover travel began. We did not spend the ride arguing. That almost made it worse. He kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the gear selector, and we talked around the real subject. Noah's sleep schedule, Emma's upcoming school assignment, a package expected later in the week. The small scaffolding of marriage remained standing, even while something underneath it had begun to shift. When I got out, Adrian squeezed my hand. For a moment I wanted to reopen the conversation from the kitchen. I wanted to tell him that I knew the secrecy was harder on him than I often admitted. I wanted to ask him what he needed that I could actually give, without promising something I had no right to promise. But departure windows did not care about unfinished marriages. I told myself we had 15 days. I was wrong even about that. Once I crossed into the next phase of the assignment, my ordinary life narrowed quickly. My personal phone was no longer something I could check because I missed my children. My name became the one attached to the work in front of me. The family photographs I carried stayed where no casual observer could connect them to the person I was pretending to be. My real home, less than an hour away at certain points during that assignment, became more unreachable than places I had once traveled thousands of miles to reach. My family believed I was overseas. I let them believe it because that was what the work required, and because I believed they were safe. For years afterward, that assumption was one of the hardest things to forgive in myself. There was one thing I did not know when I left on May 4. A few days later, Adrian used the emergency number I had given him. I learned this much later from the call record and from the people who reconstructed those days with me. He was not reporting an emergency. He wanted to know whether my assignment was legitimate and whether the return date had changed. The person on the line did exactly what the system allowed. No location, no client information, no confidential details. But Adrian was told enough. My assignment was authorized. My expected return date remained May 19. He knew I had not vanished. He knew the organization I worked through expected me back on schedule. He knew there was a functioning emergency channel if something truly happened to our children. That should have ended one story before it began. Instead, Simone Keller, my cousin, would later tell me that Adrian contacted her that same evening. At the time, she believed he was an exhausted husband confiding in family. She had no reason to preserve the conversation as evidence. She simply remembered it because the sentence struck her as unusually bleak coming from a man whose wife had been gone only a few days. He told her, "I honestly don't know if Mara intends to come home." By then, Adrian had already been told the exact opposite. That was the first lie I could date. And once I understood that, I had to reconsider everything that came after. Once I knew Adrian had been told I was coming home on May 19th, The next question became harder to live with. Why would a man who had just confirmed his wife was exactly where she was supposed to be tell someone else he did not know whether she intended to return? At first, I wanted to treat that sentence as anger. People say ugly things when they feel abandoned, and I had been away only a few days. Maybe Adrian had wanted sympathy. Maybe he wanted Simone to tell him he was doing a good job with Noah. Maybe hearing a stranger on an emergency line refuse to give him my location had made him feel small in a way he did not know how to admit. Those explanations lasted until I learned he had not told everyone the same version. Simone was the first person who helped me see the pattern, though neither of us recognized it as a pattern while it was happening. She was my cousin, a few years older than me, close enough to the family to be included in holidays, but not so close that she knew the private machinery of my marriage. Adrian had always liked her, because she listened without immediately offering solutions. When she finally told me about those early conversations, months later she did not remember every sentence. What she remembered was how carefully Adrian had phrased things. He rarely made a statement that was completely false. He told her I would not answer his calls, leaving out that I could not. He said I had gone away, while Noah was 6 months old, leaving out the childcare and backup arrangements. He said he did not know where his wife was, which was true, but not that the location was protected by the terms of my work. The story formed in the missing context. Adrian understood the difference between an unreachable wife and an abandoning one. Simone said he never asked her to condemn me. He did not have to. He spoke in the exhausted language of someone who wanted to be seen as the person holding the house together. He mentioned Noah waking at night. He mentioned Emma missing me. He mentioned laundry, appointments, meals, all the ordinary weight of parenthood, as if those things had appeared only because I had boarded a plane. Listening to Simone describe it later, I began to see how little Adrian needed to invent. He took the facts of our life and shaved away everything that made my absence temporary, planned, or understandable. What remained was a woman who kept leaving. That woman was useful to him. I was still too far away from home to know she existed. During those first days of the assignment, my world had narrowed to routine and discipline. I woke in a room that did not feel like mine, used a name I never used at home, and moved through a logistics corridor in Maryland that my family believed was an ocean away. The irony did not feel dramatic at the time. It felt procedural. Distance was not measured in miles. It was measured in what I could safely connect. There were mornings when the road I traveled would have taken me home in less than an hour if I had turned the right direction. I did not turn. I trusted the systems I had left behind. That trust made everything Adrian did possible. The childcare changes began quietly. I did not know about them until later, when dates on scheduling records were placed beside Helen's account and Adrian's own explanations. The arrangement I had set up before leaving was simple. Our regular childcare covered the hours Adrian's work made difficult, while my parents were backup. I had chosen it that way deliberately. Thomas and Helen loved their grandchildren, but they were not supposed to absorb my entire absence. A few days after I left, Adrian reduced some of those scheduled hours. His explanation afterward was practical enough to sound reasonable. He said there was no point paying someone else when my parents had already offered to help. He said Noah was easier with family. He said Emma preferred staying somewhere familiar after school. No single decision looked sinister. The consequence was what mattered. My parents began carrying more of the daily burden. Noah was at their house longer. Emma spent more afternoons there. Helen handled more bottles, naps, meals, and pickup logistics than I had arranged. Thomas found himself reorganizing his day around a baby he loved, but had not expected to supervise for hours at a time. The strain Adrian had complained about began appearing in their lives too. He had not manufactured sleeplessness. Noah really was 6 months old. Babies really did cry, refuse naps, soil clothes minutes after being changed, and require more coordination than anyone remembered once their own children grew up. Emma really did have homework, rides, and the moods of a 14-year-old living in a house where adults had begun discussing her mother like a problem. But Adrian had quietly removed part of the structure designed to absorb those pressures. Then he allowed my parents to experience the result. Helen admitted this much later, not proudly and not all at once. She told me that by the end of that first week, she had begun to feel tired in a way that made Adrian's complaints sound more reasonable. When Noah cried through an afternoon nap, or Emma needed transportation while Adrian was working, my absence stopped being an abstract professional obligation and became something Helen could feel in her shoulders. That was when she started saying I needed to understand what my work cost everyone. She did not say it to hurt me because I was not there to hear it. She said it because she believed it. My mother had spent most of her adult life converting sacrifice into virtue. She had not complained when she turned down a job that required travel. She had not complained when family responsibilities reduced her choices. Over the years, those decisions stopped being decisions in the way she remembered them. They became proof of what a good mother did. That belief protected her from one uncomfortable possibility. Maybe she had wanted more. Maybe she had given up things she had not absolutely needed to give up. If my life could contain children and work that mattered to me, then some of the rules Helen had lived by were not rules at all. I did not understand how personally she experienced that contradiction until much later. At the time, Emma was the one who felt it first. She told me afterward about an afternoon at my parents' house when Thomas made a remark about my choices. Emma had been at the dining table with schoolwork spread around her, while Noah slept in the next room. My father was irritated about having rearranged something in his day. He blamed the situation on my work. Emma corrected him. Not dramatically. Not disrespectfully. At least by the standards most people would use. She reminded him that I had not left without telling anyone. I was working, and I was coming back. Thomas heard the correction as a challenge. That difference mattered. Emma had always been observant, but she was not the kind of child who gave speeches at the dinner table. She had learned sarcasm before she learned diplomacy, and her usual defense against adult seriousness was humor. If my father complained about traffic, Emma would suggest building him a private highway. If Helen overpacked food for a 2-hour visit, Emma would ask whether we were evacuating Maryland. She had once announced that my emergency binder contained enough information to rebuild civilization after a meteor strike. By the middle of that week, those jokes had begun disappearing. I did not witness the change. I noticed it only in hindsight, through the way Emma described those days and through what she did not describe. There was no story about teasing Thomas, no story about making fun of Adrian's coffee, no message Simone remembered hearing repeated because Emma had said something ridiculous. The humor had not vanished because someone formally took it away. It disappeared because Emma had begun monitoring the room before she spoke. That is one of the cruelest things adults can do to a child without ever touching them. They can make her calculate the cost of every sentence. My father's irritation deepened because Emma would not accept the premise everyone around her seemed increasingly comfortable with, that my absence was evidence of a moral failure. In his view, she was 14. Adults had context, she did not. A child's job was to listen. Emma did listen. That was part of the problem. She heard more than they realized. While those conversations unfolded at home, I was moving through a different version of Maryland. My work during those days was mostly waiting. Observation and controlled routines in ordinary places, warehouses, business parks, forgettable hotel rooms. The essential rule was simple. My real name stayed separate from the identity attached to the assignment. My family believed I was overseas because that was the travel explanation attached to the cover they knew. In reality, there were times I was less than 40 miles from Emma. If she had stood on the right overpass, and I had driven beneath it, at the right minute, we might have been close enough to occupy the same photograph. Neither of us knew. That fact became unbearable after I learned what was happening in the house during those days. At the time, it simply meant I followed procedure. I woke. I worked. I avoided unnecessary contact. I counted forward toward May 19th. At home, Adrian was counting toward the same date for a very different reason. Helen was the one who eventually told me when the idea of an intervention became explicit. She remembered Adrian using the word because it made what they were planning sound responsible. An intervention was something families did when they loved someone who had lost perspective. It suggested concern instead of coercion. It suggested that everyone in the room was there to help. According to Helen, Adrian said there needed to be a conversation when I returned, where no one allowed me to dismiss the damage my work was causing. My father agreed immediately. Helen hesitated over the word damage, but not over the underlying idea. They arrived there for different reasons. Adrian resented the part of my life he could not enter. Thomas saw my independence as a challenge to family authority, and Helen believed motherhood should demand more sacrifice. None of them thought they were plotting against me. In their minds, they were making me see reason. When Helen described it later, she used phrases that sounded almost gentle. They wanted to sit me down. They wanted me to hear how hard the previous days had been. They wanted Adrian to be able to explain what my absences did to the marriage. They wanted me to understand that Noah was still a baby, and Emma was old enough to notice more than I thought. Underneath those soft words was a harder assumption. My return was not going to be a reunion. It was going to be a correction. Adrian wanted the room prepared before I entered it. That meant my parents could not merely be sympathetic to him. They needed to have lived the burden. They needed to believe my work had placed it on them. They needed to see themselves as the people who had stayed behind and held things together. Reducing childcare had done more than save money. It had changed who felt entitled to judge my choices. My parents were no longer backup. In their own minds, they were becoming evidence. There was another problem Adrian had not anticipated. Emma, a 14-year-old, does not understand marriage the way adults do, but she understands whether somebody told her they were coming back. She remembered the 19th. She remembered hugging me by the front door. She remembered asking directly. And each time someone used language suggesting I had abandoned them, that memory collided with what she was hearing. At first, she simply corrected people. Then she began paying attention to who said what. The versions did not match. Adrian told one relative he did not know when I would return. Helen said I was expected back but needed to rethink future assignments. Thomas spoke as though the fact I had accepted the trip proved I had chosen work over my children. Emma was not trained to analyze contradictions. She did not need to be. Children notice when adults keep moving the shape of the truth. She also began noticing how the house changed when she defended me. Conversation stopped when she entered rooms. Helen softened her voice. Thomas became more formal. Adrian began telling her some topics belonged between adults. That phrase irritated Emma more than almost anything else. Adult matter. As though whether her mother had abandoned her was somehow not about her. She did not know what they were planning. She only knew they kept trying to assign a meaning to my absence that she did not recognize. One evening, according to what Emma later told me, she was walking toward the kitchen at my parents' house when she heard Adrian's voice coming from another room. She slowed before reaching the doorway. She was not deliberately eavesdropping at first. She heard my name. Then she heard the words "when she gets home." That made her stop. Adrian was telling my parents that whatever happened next could not be allowed to end with everyone pretending the previous 2 weeks had been normal. His voice was low enough that Emma could not catch every sentence. Thomas answered him. Helen said something Emma later remembered as cautious, though she could not recall the exact words. Then Adrian said one sentence clearly enough that it stayed with her. "If nothing changes when she gets home, she'll leave again." Emma stood in the hallway with one hand against the wall. She knew I traveled for work. She knew Adrian hated some of those trips. She knew her grandparents thought mothers should be home more than I was. But this sounded different. They were not talking about whether I would come back. They were talking about what I would be allowed to do once I did. Emma backed away before they noticed her. Years later, when she described that moment, she did not tell me she had understood the plan. She had not. She told me something much simpler. She said it was the first time my return stopped, sounding like something the family was waiting for. It sounded like a trial, whose verdict had already been decided. The first mistake Adrian made was assuming Emma's age made her easier to control. 14 is an awkward borderland. Adults still expect obedience, but a child that age has already accumulated enough memories to compare what she is being told against what she actually saw. Emma did not understand my marriage. She did not know what my work was. She had no idea why Adrian had begun measuring our life in terms of who stayed and who left. But she knew 3 things with the certainty children reserve for promises they have taken seriously. I had hugged her before I went. I had told her I was working, and I had said I would be home on May 19th. Everything Adrian needed from Emma required her to loosen her grip on at least one of those facts. He did not start by demanding that she lie. That would have failed immediately. Emma later told me the first conversations almost sounded like concern. Adrian asked how she felt about my being gone again. He wanted to know whether she was angry with me, whether she wished I had stayed home, whether taking an assignment so soon after Noah's birth seemed fair to her. None of those were unreasonable questions on their own. In another family, asked without an agenda, they might even have been useful. Emma gave him answers he did not expect. She did miss me. She was annoyed that I had left before one of her school events. She hated that there were stretches when she could not send me something stupid she had seen online and know whether I had received it. She wished my job were easier. What she would not do was turn any of those feelings into abandonment. According to Emma, Adrian kept returning to the same point from slightly different directions. He reminded her how young Noah was. He talked about how much work the household had become. He said grandparents should not have to rearrange their lives because one parent kept disappearing. Emma listened longer than most adults would have given her credit for. Then she told him that being mad at me was not the same as believing I had left them. That isn't the same as leaving us. It was not a dramatic line. She did not slam a door afterward. She did not understand that the distinction she had just made was the exact distinction Adrian needed erased. To Emma, it was obvious. To Adrian, it was resistance. I learned much of this from her in pieces, because trauma rarely returns in neat chronological order. Emma would remember a sentence while folding laundry, or a particular chair while passing my parents' dining room months later. Sometimes the least important details arrived first. She remembered Adrian turning Noah's bottle slowly between his palms while he talked to her. She remembered the faint ring of dried formula around the cap. She remembered watching that ring instead of looking at her father, because eye contact made the conversation feel like a test. What she remembered most clearly was how Adrian kept pressing until every feeling became evidence against me. Missing me meant I had hurt her. Anger meant I had chosen work, and defending me meant she had been trained to protect me. Emma could not simply be a daughter who missed her mother. She encountered that trap before I understood the larger version being built around me. A few days after she overheard the conversation about my return, Adrian shifted from asking what she felt to telling her what her loyalty meant. She was in my parents' kitchen when it happened. Helen had Noah in another room. Thomas was outside. Emma had been trying to finish an assignment at the table, one foot tucked beneath her, pencil marks pressed hard enough into the paper to leave grooves on the sheet underneath. Adrian told her he needed her to stop making things harder. He framed the problem as though Emma's insistence on my returning were part of what allowed me to keep leaving. Then he gave her the sentence she would repeat to me, months later with the same disbelief still attached to it. If you keep defending her, you're helping her choose that job over this family. Emma did not have the vocabulary for coercive loyalty. She did not need it. She heard what mattered. Telling the truth had been redefined as taking my side against everyone else. That was when she began to pull away from Adrian. Not physically. She still lived under the same roof. She still handed him Noah when asked, still went to school, still sat through dinner, but she stopped volunteering things to him. A funny story from class stayed with her, instead of being shared. A complaint about a teacher did not make it into the kitchen. She began using the smallest possible answers when Adrian asked about her day. Adults often notice defiance before they notice withdrawal. Adrian noticed the first and missed the second. At school, the change looked different. Emma had never been an exceptional student in the way people sometimes write traumatized children after the fact, as though pain must make them precociously brilliant to deserve sympathy. She was good at subjects she liked, impatient with ones she did not, and capable of spending 20 minutes formatting a title page to avoid 5 minutes of actual work. She forgot things. She procrastinated. She had opinions about teachers that changed depending on the assignment due that week. During the second week of my absence, one of her teachers noticed she had stopped turning in work with her usual reliability. The school counselor checked in. I saw the note much later as part of the records gathered after everything happened. It was brief and ordinary. Emma appeared tired. She reported stress at home. Mother was away for work. Father and grandparents were providing care. No immediate safety concern had been identified at that point. What mattered was the language Emma used. She told the counselor I was away for work and coming home. She did not say I had left. The counselor had no reason to know that choice of words mattered. Adrian did. When he learned the school had asked about home, he became angry that Emma had involved someone outside the family. He did not accuse her of lying. There was nothing to accuse. Instead, he told her private matters should stay private, and that speaking carelessly could create problems she did not understand. That warning landed differently because Emma had already begun sensing that every adult around her seemed concerned with how the family looked from the outside. She told me later that was when she started wondering whether the problem was not that she misunderstood what was happening. Maybe she understood too much. Her phone became part of that struggle almost by accident. One evening, after another conversation in which Adrian described my absence as something I had imposed on everyone, Emma decided she wanted to call Simone. She trusted Simone precisely because Simone was close enough to know us and distant enough not to live inside our house. Emma did not intend to expose anyone. She wanted to ask why everyone kept saying I had left when I had told her I was coming back. Adrian saw the phone in her hand before she made the call. He later described taking it as ordinary discipline. Emma had been upset, he said, and he did not want her dragging extended family into what he considered a private marriage issue. He kept the phone for a few hours, then returned it. At the time, it looked minor. A parent taking a teenager's phone is hardly unusual. But that moment taught Emma something Adrian did not intend to teach her. He did not just want her quiet with him. He wanted the story contained. After that, she became more careful about reaching outward. She still had the phone. There was no grand confiscation. No one smashed it or hid it for days. By Saturday morning, May 16th, it would be sitting on my parents' kitchen counter, plugged into the charger where Emma had left it. That small fact would later explain why a 14-year-old could walk out of a house in 2026 and immediately become difficult to locate. At the time, it was only another ordinary object sitting between adults who believed they still controlled the boundaries of the situation. The deeper damage came from another conversation. Emma had been helping with Noah more than I had intended, because the childcare hours I arranged had been reduced. She did not resent her brother. If anything, she took too much pride in being useful with him. She knew which song settled him quickest, which bottle nipple he preferred, which side he turned his head toward when he was overtired. She could tell the difference between his hungry cry and the high, offended noise he made when someone tried to put him down before he was ready. That competence made it easy for the adults around her to lean on it. One afternoon, after Noah had been restless and the house had been particularly tense, Emma said that if everyone was too busy arguing to take care of him properly, she would find someone who could help. She was angry. She was 14. The sentence was not a legal threat. It was a child announcing that the baby in front of her mattered more than whatever the adults were fighting about. Adrian answered in a way that would stay lodged in her mind. He warned her that if she started taking Noah away from the adults responsible for him, or involved authorities by making the house sound unsafe, she could cause exactly the thing she was supposedly trying to prevent. People might decide she had no right to keep Noah with her. The two of them could be separated. He did not give her a legal explanation because he did not have one. He gave her fear. Emma knew enough about the world to know adults could take children from houses. She did not know enough to understand when that happened, under what conditions, or how child welfare decisions actually worked. Adrian did not need her to believe a precise falsehood. He only needed her to associate asking official people for help with losing her baby brother. Once planted, the image did the rest. It is difficult to describe what I felt when she eventually told me that without reducing it to anger. Anger is loud in memory. This was quieter. I remember sitting with my hands flat against my knees, because I did not trust them to stay still. I remember noticing one loose thread on the cuff of Emma's sweatshirt. I remember thinking that Adrian had spent years telling people my work was dangerous because of the things he did not know, while he had used what Emma did not know as leverage against her. I did not say that to her. She did not need my interpretation. She needed me to hear what happened. While Emma was learning that the wrong answer could cost her access to people she trusted, Adrian and my parents were making the intervention more concrete. Helen was eventually the person who confirmed the structure of it. She did so long after the fact, when the soft language had stopped protecting anyone. By then, they had moved beyond the vague idea that I needed to rethink things. They had decided what change should look like. When I returned on May 19th, Adrian intended to tell me he would no longer accept assignments that made me unreachable. He wanted access to my real locations. He wanted a marriage in which confidential could no longer end a question simply because my work said it had to. My parents would support him. Helen wanted me to reduce travel while Noah was young. Thomas wanted Adrian to stop tolerating what he called secrecy inside a marriage. And if I refused, Adrian intended to separate. He did not intend an instant legal rupture. The pressure was subtler. The life I came home to would be placed directly beside the choice to continue my work. They also knew that by then, relatives had already heard enough about my absence that the moral framing was prepared. Mara came home. Mara was shown what her choices had done. Mara chose again. If I left for another assignment afterward, Adrian would not have to convince anyone that I had picked work over family. They would believe they had watched me do it. The more I learned about that plan later, the more one detail disturbed me. Nobody in that room seemed to ask what would happen if my work was not something I could simply explain to satisfy my husband. They treated secrecy as a preference, a marital habit, a wall I had built because I liked having a room in my life no one else could enter. Adrian had lived with the limitations long enough to know there were legal boundaries. He had called the emergency line himself and been told the assignment was valid. Yet, somewhere between knowing that and resenting it, he decided my inability to tell him everything was proof that he had the right to force the issue. He still did not know what my work actually was. Neither did my parents. That ignorance did not make them cautious. It made them more certain. Emma heard the clearest version of their thinking by accident. She had gone to get something from the hallway outside my parents' den. Noah was with Helen. Adrian and Thomas were talking inside. Helen was moving between rooms and joined them, while Emma was close enough to hear voices, but not every word. She had already learned to stop walking when my name appeared in adult conversation. What she caught were pieces. My assignment, May 19th. Adrian saying this could not happen again. Thomas agreeing that I needed to understand consequences. Then a sentence about the children. Emma moved closer. She later told me she did not remember who said the first half of it because the second half landed so hard that everything around it blurred. The phrase was, "The children do better with people who stay." No one had asked Emma whether she was doing better. No one had asked whether she wanted to be used as evidence. No one had asked whether spending extra afternoons at her grandparents' house meant she preferred them to me. They had taken the logistical consequences of my absence, increased some of them themselves, and were now pointing to the result as proof. Emma walked into the room. She did not plan a speech. She did not have one. What came out was the kind of sentence a furious 14-year-old says when adults have spent too long speaking around her. "Mom didn't abandon us. You're trying to make it look like she did." The room changed. Emma remembered that more clearly than anyone's face. Before she entered, the conversation had belonged to adults discussing another adult. After that sentence, Emma became part of the problem they believed needed correcting. Helen was the first to react, not to the accusation, but to Emma's tone. She asked her to calm down and reminded her that interrupting adults was disrespectful. Adrian did not shout. He told Emma she had misunderstood what they were discussing. Thomas took it personally. My father had spent his life believing authority and responsibility were linked. If you carried responsibility for a family, he believed, you earned the right to decide what was best for it. The possibility that a 14-year-old could correctly identify something he had failed to see did not fit comfortably inside that worldview. Emma did not back down. She was angry enough to forget the careful way she had begun measuring every sentence. She reminded them that I had told her the exact date I would return. She said Adrian knew it too. She did not accuse anyone of conspiracy. She did not understand that much. She only knew the story they were telling did not match the promise she had heard from me. Helen tried again to redirect the issue toward respect. Emma refused to apologize for saying I was coming home. That refusal mattered more than the argument itself. For days, Adrian had been trying to turn my absence into a lesson. Now Emma was refusing to learn the lesson. Thomas looked at her across the room. When Emma told me about that moment, she did not describe him as raging. That would have been easier for her to understand. She said his face seemed to close. The expression became controlled, almost formal. Then he said the sentence that told her exactly how little her memory was worth to the adults around her. "You're 14. You don't get to tell the adults in this family what's true." Emma stopped arguing after that. Not because she believed him, because for the first time, she understood that they were no longer asking her what she remembered. They were deciding whether she had the right to remember it at all. By the time Saturday, May 16th arrived, Emma had already learned that telling the truth did not necessarily make adults stop arguing. Sometimes, it only made them more determined to prove that the problem was the person saying it. I did not witness that morning. I rebuilt it afterward from Emma's account, Helen's statements, Thomas's reluctant admissions, the police timeline, and the pieces Adrian could no longer make fit once everyone was interviewed separately. Some details differed depending on who told them. The important ones did not. Emma and Noah had spent more and more time at my parents' house during the second week I was gone. That had never been my plan. My parents were supposed to be backup. By then, they had become part of the daily structure because Adrian had reduced the childcare hours I had arranged before leaving. Noah's diapers were stacked in a basket beneath Helen's guest room changing table. A few bottles had migrated into her refrigerator. Emma's school backpack seemed to live beside the same chair every afternoon. That Saturday morning began with nothing dramatic enough to warn anyone what would come next. No storm, no medical emergency, no broken window, just a tired house. Noah had slept poorly. Emma had been awake more than once because she heard him through the wall and got up before Helen did. She had learned his rhythms too well during those days. When he made the low, restless sound that meant he was almost awake, she would lie still and wait. If the sound stopped, she stayed in bed. If it sharpened into the small, offended cry, that meant he wanted someone now, Emma was often already moving before the adults around her decided whose turn it was. That morning, she had him strapped against her chest in a soft baby carrier while she tried to eat breakfast. Helen later remembered telling her she did not need to carry him constantly. Emma said Noah had just settled, and she did not want to wake him. That sounded ordinary enough. It was only later that I understood how quickly Emma had begun using the language of responsibility. Not "I like holding him," not "he wants me." He finally settled. She had started speaking like someone whose job was to keep the day from getting worse. Thomas was already irritated. According to Helen, he had changed a morning plan because Adrian said he needed help again. He did not complain directly about Noah. My father loved his grandson. His frustration settled instead on the person who was not in the room, me. He made another comment about how families should not have to reorganize themselves every time one person decided work came first. Emma had heard versions of that sentence for days. Normally, she would have withdrawn or changed rooms. That morning, she answered. She reminded him that I had arranged care before I left. She pointed out that Adrian had been the one changing those arrangements. She said, with the bluntness of a tired 14-year-old, that if everyone was angry about doing more work than expected, maybe they should ask why the childcare I paid for was not being used. That detail mattered because it exposed something Thomas had not wanted to consider. He had been treating his exhaustion as evidence against me. Emma had just connected it to a decision made after I left. My father did not like the implication. Helen tried to move past it. She told Emma to eat while Noah was quiet. She told Thomas there was no point starting another argument before 9 in the morning. Had everyone listened to her at that exact moment, maybe the day would have gone differently. But appeasement was never the same as intervention. Helen wanted the conflict to become quieter. She did not challenge the assumptions underneath it. Emma sat down with Noah still against her chest. Her own breakfast had gone cold. She picked at it with one hand while supporting the baby with the other. Her phone was charging on the kitchen counter a few feet away. She had plugged it in after waking because she had forgotten the night before. That phone would stay there. No one noticed it then. A few minutes later, Adrian called. Thomas had already told him Emma was being difficult. I never learned the exact words my father used in that first call, only that he described her as disrespectful and increasingly impossible to reason with. Adrian came over instead of letting the argument cool. By the official timeline, he arrived before 8. That fact became important later because his first police statement placed him elsewhere during the moment Emma left. Emma remembered hearing his car before she saw him. She was in the living room by then, still carrying Noah. The baby had fallen asleep against her, his cheek pressed into the fabric between her collarbone and shoulder. Adrian entered a house where 3 people already believed different versions of the same problem. Thomas believed Emma needed discipline. Helen believed everyone needed to calm down. Emma believed the adults were deliberately changing the story about me. Adrian arrived already, believing Emma's refusal to cooperate was evidence that my absence had destabilized her. No one entered that room intending to put 2 children outside. That is important, because what happened next was not the result of a carefully planned act of cruelty. It was the result of adults who had become so committed to winning a moral argument that they stopped recognizing the point at which children were no longer safe inside it. Adrian began by trying to bring Emma back to what he called respect. He told her she had been speaking to Thomas in a way that would not be accepted. He repeated that the family had been under pressure because I was gone. He expected Emma to recognize that everyone was exhausted and stop challenging the people caring for her. Emma did not deny that they were tired. She went back to the part that mattered to her. I had not left them. They knew when I was coming home. And Adrian knew it better than anyone. She had finally started saying that last part openly. "You know Mom is coming back." Helen later remembered the sentence because of what followed. Adrian answered that the issue was not the date on a calendar. The issue was that I kept making choices that required everyone else to absorb the consequences. Emma looked at him, then at Thomas. "You're saying it like she left us." That was the line that pushed the argument over whatever fragile edge remained. Helen tried to correct Emma's tone. Again, not the facts. The tone, that detail hurt me almost as much as anything else, she admitted afterward. My mother had heard her granddaughter asking adults to stop describing her mother as someone who had abandoned her, and Helen's instinct was still to make the child sound more polite while asking. Emma's breathing had changed by then. She told me later she could feel Noah moving against her chest every time she took a breath too quickly, so she was trying not to raise her voice. That effort made Thomas angrier, not calmer. My father interpreted composure as defiance. He told her she had become impossible since I left. He accused her of parroting my attitude. Emma said she was not parroting anyone. She remembered what I told her. Thomas said something about children not understanding adult decisions. Emma answered that adults did not get to change what happened just because they did not like it. That was the closest she came to a speech. There was nothing polished about it. She was tired, frightened by the tension, and angry enough that the words arrived faster than she could soften them. Thomas stood. Helen remembered that clearly. So did Emma. No one remembered him raising his voice at first. My father was most intimidating when he went quiet. He had spent years believing calmness proved authority. He could say something cruel in an even voice and still consider himself the reasonable person in the room. He looked at Emma with Noah against her chest and told her if she was so certain I had chosen her, then she could go wait for me. If you're so sure, be so sure she chose you, then go wait for her. That sentence became the hinge of everything. Emma stared at him. She did not understand whether he meant the porch, the sidewalk, or simply get out of my sight. Thomas later insisted he had meant for her to cool off. Helen said she assumed Emma would step outside and return after a few minutes. Adrian was Noah stirred. Helen told Emma to hand the baby over first. Thomas repeated it. Emma looked at Adrian. That was the part she remembered most painfully. She expected her father to step forward, not even to defend me, to take his son, to end the absurdity of a 14-year-old standing at the door with a 6-month-old baby while 3 adults argued about loyalty. Adrian did not move. Emma told me his arms remained at his sides. She could not remember his exact expression. That bothered her for months. She wanted there to have been something unmistakable on his face. Anger, regret, fear, something she could name and place beside the decision he made. Instead, she remembered stillness. Noah had begun fussing against her. Emma looked down at him and then back at the adults. Later, she told me that her thoughts were not sophisticated in that moment. She was not weighing custody rights or legal responsibilities. She was not deciding she could raise her brother better than his father. She was frightened. The adults were angry. Noah was crying. And every time the argument had gotten worse during the previous days, Emma had been the person who picked him up. So she did what children often do when a responsibility has been repeated enough times. She assumed it was hers. She would not put him down. Helen told her again. Emma backed toward the hallway. The diaper bag sat near the front door because Noah had been brought over with it. Emma's school backpack was nearby too. She grabbed both without thinking beyond the next few minutes. Her phone stayed on the kitchen counter. If she had been planning to run away, that alone would have made very little sense. She stepped outside. No one followed her. That was the first choice. Thomas had said the words impulsively. Emma had obeyed them. There was still time for any adult in that house to walk through the door, take Noah, bring Emma back inside, and end the mistake while it was still small enough to be called one. Nobody did. Helen told herself 5 minutes would calm everyone down. Thomas expected Emma to return when she realized he would not chase her. Adrian later claimed he thought Emma needed space. 3 different explanations. The same closed door. Emma started walking. She did not have a destination. She moved through the neighborhood because standing outside the house felt worse than moving away from it. Noah had settled again. The carrier held his weight close enough to her body that she could walk without using both arms, but the diaper bag pulled at one shoulder and her backpack at the other. At first she thought she might circle the block, then she thought about returning. Then, she imagined Thomas's face, and Adrian telling her she had caused the entire problem by defending me. She kept walking. By the time 5 minutes passed inside the house, Emma was farther away than anyone expected. Helen looked through the front window. Thomas waited. Adrian did not use the emergency number I had written down for him. That omission was not an accident. I know because he had already used the number successfully once. On May 7th, he had called it because he wanted reassurance about my assignment. On May 16th, with both of his children outside the house and one of them an infant, he did not call. When investigators later asked why, Adrian said he did not believe the line would reach me quickly enough. That explanation might have sounded plausible if the earlier call did not exist. He knew the channel worked. He simply did not want the crisis described through a system that might record what had actually happened before he had decided how to describe it. The first half hour passed. Emma kept moving. She did not know adults had begun checking nearby streets. She did not know Helen had grown worried enough to call her name from the front yard. She did not know Thomas had started driving short loops through the neighborhood. She only knew nobody had come after her when the door was still close enough to see. By then, going back felt different. A child can walk away in anger and still believe home is behind her. But after enough time passes without anyone coming, the meaning of the distance changes. She began believing they meant it. Noah woke hungry. Emma found a bench near a small commercial strip and took what she needed from the diaper bag. There was enough formula for the moment. Enough diapers for several changes, a bottle, wipes, a lightweight blanket, normal baby supplies, not provisions for running away. She fed him and watched cars pass. At some point, she reached into her backpack for her phone. Only then did she remember it was charging in Helen's kitchen. Emma told me that was the first moment panic felt physical. Until then, she had been angry. Without the phone, the world suddenly became larger. She could not call Simone. She could not call a friend. She could not even check the time without looking for a clock. She thought about asking an adult to call police. Then Adrian's warnings surfaced. If she took Noah, if she involved authorities, if they thought something was wrong, they could separate them. That was not how the law worked in the simple, automatic way Emma imagined it. But Emma was 14. She had no reason to understand the difference between a safety assessment and punishment. The person who should have made adults feel safe to her had taught her that official help might take away the one person she was trying to protect. So, when she eventually saw a police cruiser moving slowly through one of the streets nearby, Emma did not wave. She moved away from the road. That decision would later look irrational to people reading the timeline. It was irrational. Fear often is. What mattered was who had planted it. Inside my parents' house, the situation crossed another line. By approximately 9:30, no one believed Emma was simply standing around the corner anymore. They had her phone. They knew she had Noah. They knew she had not packed clothes. They knew she had left after Thomas told her to go. This was the last clean opportunity to tell the truth without adding another layer. Thomas could have called the police and said he had lost his temper and ordered his granddaughter out. Adrian could have said he watched his daughter leave carrying his infant son and failed to stop her. Helen could have said she had expected Emma back and now feared something was wrong. Instead, they argued about how to describe it. No one later admitted using the word strategy. I do not believe they sat around a table consciously designing a false report. But they all understood the danger of the truth. If police heard that the people accusing me of abandoning my children had just sent a 14-year-old into the street with a baby, the moral structure they had been building around my absence would collapse before I even came home. At 10:15 that morning, Adrian made the report. The dispatcher's record became one of the cleanest pieces of evidence later because it captured not only what Adrian said, But when he said it, he reported his teenage daughter missing with her infant brother. That part was true. Then he changed the circumstances. He said no adult had instructed Emma to leave. He said he had not been in the room when she walked out. He said Emma had been threatening to run away in the days leading up to that morning. And when asked about reaching me, he made the family situation sound as though there were no reliable emergency channel available. Each of those statements did something useful for him. They turned Thomas's command into Emma's plan. They moved Adrian away from the door. They transformed an impulsive act by adults into a pattern of teenage instability. They kept my absence inside the story as the cause. Once that report existed, Emma stopped being the child who had been told to leave. She became the runaway daughter of an absent mother. Police did not treat the case casually. Whatever Adrian had hoped to control about the narrative, a 14-year-old missing with a 6-month-old infant created a response larger than the family. Officers began checking the immediate area, likely destinations, friends, and nearby commercial routes. The exact procedural details mattered less to me later than one fact. People were looking. Emma simply did not know whom she could trust. By midday, she had been away for several hours. The baby carrier was beginning to hurt her shoulders. Noah's weight was not enormous, but 6 months of baby pressed against the same points on a 14-year-old body becomes heavy quickly. Emma shifted him when she could. She sat whenever she found somewhere public enough to feel safe, but not so exposed that she thought police might immediately separate them. She had cash in her wallet. Not much. The backpack held a water bottle, a hoodie, and the school things she had never expected to carry beyond the weekend. The diaper bag held enough supplies for an ordinary visit with grandparents, not a day without knowing when home would become safe again. Emma used money on diapers first, then water, then something for Noah. She ate almost nothing. The commercial area gave her anonymity. People saw a teenager with a baby and supplied their own explanations. Older sister helping a parent. Young mother. Babysitter. Someone waiting for a ride. Most people looked only long enough to categorize her. That invisibility frightened me when I heard about it later. But it also explained how she could move through crowded places while officers searched nearby streets. She was not hiding in woods. She was walking among people who did not know they were supposed to recognize her. By late afternoon, the diaper bag felt lighter. Noah had gone through more formula than Emma expected because stress had wrecked her sense of time. She had fed him whenever his cries told her he was hungry, but she no longer knew exactly how many hours had passed. She found herself outside a grocery store in the same commercial corridor where, less than an hour away by ordinary driving, I was still living under another name. Emma checked the money left in her wallet. There was enough for something small to eat, but nowhere near enough for another can of formula. Her stomach had been empty so long that hunger had stopped feeling sharp. It had become a hollow heaviness beneath her ribs. Noah stirred against her chest. Emma looked through the glass doors at shelves she could not afford to think of as shelves anymore. Everything had turned into calculations. Food for her had become optional. Formula for Noah had not. She closed her wallet without buying anything for herself. Then she stood outside the store, adjusted Noah's weight against her chest, and began asking strangers for help. By late afternoon on May 16th, I was standing less than 20 miles from my daughter without knowing she had been missing for most of the day. That fact still feels impossible when I say it plainly. My family believed I was overseas. Emma believed I was somewhere far enough away that calling me was not an option even if she had still had her phone. Police were searching roads and neighborhoods that sat inside the same county where I was working under another name. And I was moving through a commercial logistics corridor, so ordinary that nothing about it suggested two parts of my life were about to collide. The assignment had brought me there because the area made sense for the work attached to my cover. Warehouses sat behind strips of retail. Loading bays opened onto roads shared by delivery vans and family SUVs, and people moved through the same parking lots for entirely different reasons without noticing one another. I had been in and out of those kinds of places for days. The geography mattered because it narrowed the coincidence more than anyone understood at first. Emma had walked toward the same corridor because it had stores, public restrooms, places to sit, and the kinds of basic things Noah needed. I was there because my work had put me there. Neither of us was searching for the other. I had finished what I needed to do at one site and was crossing toward a grocery store when I first noticed the girl. Not her face. The baby. He was strapped high against her chest, in a carrier that had slipped slightly to one side. One of his small legs hung lower than the other. The girl kept adjusting the fabric with one hand while trying to hold the strap of a backpack with the other. A diaper bag rested near her feet. There was something about the way she stood that made me slow down. She was too young to carry exhaustion comfortably. Adults learn how to disguise it. We stand straighter. We put sunglasses on. We answer questions before people ask them. Teenagers still wear exhaustion honestly. It bends their shoulders and makes every movement look a little delayed. I could not see her clearly from where I was. People passed around her with shopping carts. A man handed her something small and kept walking. She looked at it, shook her head and tried to return it. He was already gone. Then I heard her speak to a woman coming out of the store. "Please, just feed my brother. I can stay hungry." The words stopped me before the voice did. There are sentences you hear as information, and there are sentences your body reacts to before your mind knows why. My hand tightened around the strap of the bag I was carrying. The woman hesitated, looked down at the baby, then at the teenager. She apologized and moved on. The girl did not argue. She simply shifted the child against her chest again and waited for the next person. I had seen desperation before. Not the cinematic version. Not people screaming for help while everyone around them understood a crisis was happening. Real desperation often looks embarrassingly ordinary. It stands beside automatic doors. It says, "Please," quietly, because saying it loudly has already failed. It tries to make one need seem smaller, so somebody will agree to meet another. The baby moved beneath the carrier. The girl bent her head toward him. Something about that gesture reached into a part of me I was supposed to keep sealed while I was undercover. I told myself I was looking at a stranger. That was still true for another few seconds. I went inside. The store smelled faintly of bakery bread, floor cleaner, and refrigerated air. I remember the combination because my senses sharpened the way they always did when something around me stopped fitting the ordinary pattern. I found infant formula faster than I should have been able to. 6 months of Noah had taught me exactly which aisle to look for. The can felt heavy in my hand. For one brief second I thought of the formula stacked at home before I left. The labels I had checked, the notes I had written for Adrian, the way Emma had mocked my planning. Mom's apocalypse plan. The memory hurt for no reason I understood yet. I paid without drawing attention. The risk was not some all-seeing camera system. It was creating a clean, avoidable association between my cover identity and a member of my real family, in a place where ordinary surveillance and observation were already part of the environment. I could help a stranger. I could not publicly become that stranger's mother. At the time, I did not know those were about to become the same act. When I came back outside, the girl had moved. I spotted the diaper bag first, near the edge of the building, then saw her heading toward the side of the shopping center where the pedestrian traffic thinned out. She had probably grown tired of standing near the main entrance or had been asked to move. I stayed far enough behind that I did not force her to react to me while we were still inside the most obvious camera coverage. I waited until we were away from the storefront and from places where an ordinary interaction could be easily tied to a name, account, or recognizable routine. There was a narrow service-side pedestrian route between the shopping center and the edge of another property, open enough that neither of us was trapped and quiet enough that I could offer help without creating a conspicuous public scene. The girl heard me coming. She turned. Everything inside me stopped. I saw Emma's face. Not the version from 12 days earlier standing in my kitchen with toast in her hand. This face was pale beneath the grime of a long day. Loose strands of hair had stuck to her forehead. Her lips were dry. There were faint marks at her shoulders, where the carrier straps had been taking Noah's weight. One side of her hoodie was stained near the pocket. And against her chest was my son, Noah. For one terrible instant, my mind tried to reject what my eyes had already proven. My fingers tightened around the formula can until the metal rim pressed into my palm. Emma looked at me. I watched recognition move through her expression so quickly I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. Her eyes widened, then changed. Not relief. Not yet. Something more careful. I had spent years being trained to control the first visible reaction my body wanted to give. That afternoon, every instinct I possessed turned against that training. I wanted to say her name. I wanted to cross the space between us. I wanted to pull Noah out of the carrier and put both hands on Emma's face and ask who had done this. I wanted to forget every restriction around me. My mouth opened. Nothing came out. Because the same mind screaming my daughter was also calculating what happened if I exposed the relationship carelessly. I was still inside, an active cover. I did not yet know why Emma was there. I did not know whether whatever had pushed her onto the street was connected to my work, whether anyone had followed her, whether anyone around the site had already seen enough to link us. I did not know whether calling her by name in that moment would protect her, or create a permanent connection between the identity I was using and the family that identity had been designed to keep separate. A mother is supposed to run toward her child. I had to decide in seconds whether running toward mine could make her easier to find for the wrong people. That was the longest moment of my life. Emma stared at me as though she were waiting for me to become someone. Her mother, a stranger, anything she could understand. Noah shifted and made a small, hungry sound. That sound gave me something concrete to do. I held out the formula. I kept my voice level. I told her it was for the baby. Nothing more. Emma did not take it immediately. Her gaze moved from the can to my face. I could see a question building in her, but she seemed afraid to let it out. Whether she understood that my silence meant danger, or simply thought she had mistaken me, I could not know then. I wanted to touch her shoulder. I did not. She finally reached for the formula. Her hand brushed mine. That tiny contact nearly broke the discipline I had been holding together by force. Her fingers were colder than I expected. I noticed a faint redness around one knuckle, dirt beneath her nails, the small trembling in her hand when she shifted the weight of the can. Those details entered me one by one. They would not leave. The family crisis resource card I had tucked into my wallet before leaving home carried Evelyn Shaw's name. Evelyn was a licensed clinical social worker and an approved emergency respite caregiver who had spent years helping families in crisis. She knew nothing about my real assignment. She only needed to know what to do when a child arrived in trouble. I pulled it out. Emma looked at it, then at me. "Go to this woman," I said. "Tell her you need help with the baby." That was all I allowed myself. I hated how it sounded. A stranger giving directions. A woman handing my daughter off to someone else. But I knew I could not solve the situation safely on the spot without first closing the risk around my cover. I also knew I could not walk away and merely hope Emma would use the card. Those two truths had to exist together. Emma took it. Her eyes stayed on mine. For a second, I thought she was going to say Mom. Her lips moved slightly. No sound came. I do not know whether she stopped because she understood something, or because she was no longer certain I was who she thought I was. That uncertainty became one of the deepest wounds between us later. I stepped back. It felt like putting physical distance between myself and every promise I had ever made her. Then I turned. I walked away from my daughter. There is no way to make that sentence prettier. I walked away. What Emma could not see happened after I was far enough from that location to act without connecting her visibly to the identity I was using. Once I was clear of the location, I activated the emergency protocol through my authorized liaison. I reported that 2 minors connected to my family were in immediate danger, that one was an infant, and that the older child had been directed to Evelyn. I required confirmation once both children were physically safe. The response was immediate in the way institutional responses often are, when the right words finally reach the right person. I was not allowed to call Emma myself. I was not allowed to race back. But the system around me moved. Evelyn was contacted. The local safety process already activated by the missing child report was tied into the new information without exposing details of my assignment that were irrelevant to protecting my children. For the first time that day, I learned that Emma and Noah had already been reported missing. The information reached me in fragments because I was not in a position to receive a full family briefing. 14-year-old female, 6-month-old infant, missing since that morning. Search in progress. I remember staring at those basic facts and feeling the world narrow around them. Missing since morning. That meant she had been out for hours. That meant someone at home knew. That meant Adrian knew. I had left him an emergency number. I had left him an exact return date. I had left him every system I could build. And somehow, my daughter had ended up asking strangers to feed her brother. I did not yet know why. That ignorance was almost unbearable. Every explanation my mind produced was worse than the one before it. Had there been an accident? Had Adrian been hurt? Had my parents failed to reach someone? Had Emma panicked and left for reasons no one understood? Had my work touched them somehow despite every precaution? The last possibility was the one I could not afford to dismiss. It was also the reason I could not expose myself before I knew more. I moved through the next stretch of time mechanically. People spoke to me. I answered when necessary. I remember a vehicle door closing somewhere nearby. A delivery truck reversing with its repetitive warning tone. The dry scrape of my thumb against the edge of my sleeve. The ordinary world kept making ordinary noises while I waited to learn whether my children had reached safety. Later, Evelyn told me what happened after Emma arrived. I did not know any of it in real time. Emma had followed the directions on the card because she had no better option left. Evelyn saw a 14-year-old carrying an exhausted baby and did not waste the first minutes demanding a complete story. Evelyn brought them inside, fed Noah, gave Emma water and food, checked that neither child needed emergency medical care, and contacted the appropriate authorities. As an approved emergency respite caregiver, she did not try to decide the custody situation herself. She reported that the missing children were physically safe, and that Emma's account raised concerns about an immediate return to the same adults. Emma's account introduced an immediate safety concern, involving the very adults who would otherwise have received her. Police and child welfare personnel began sorting through that problem. The missing child alert was updated. The search changed. From where are the children? To what happened before they left. I did not know those details yet. All I knew was that the machinery had reached them. The first confirmation came through my liaison. Emma had arrived. Noah was with her. Both were alive. Both appeared physically stable. Authorities were involved. I closed my eyes. For perhaps 3 seconds, I allowed my shoulders to drop. Then I asked whether they were being returned to the same household that night. The answer was not yet. A safety assessment was underway, because Emma had made allegations concerning the adults responsible for her and Noah that morning. A temporary approved arrangement would keep the children away from an immediate return until those circumstances could be evaluated. That was the first moment I understood the danger might not have come from outside my family. Something colder took the place of panic. I did not have enough facts to accuse anyone. I had spent too much of my professional life watching people destroy good decisions by falling in love with their first explanation. So I did what training demanded and motherhood hated. I waited for confirmed facts. But even with confirmation that Emma and Noah were physically safe, there remained one thing I could not undo. Emma had watched me walk away. She could not see the emergency response I activated afterward, or the confirmation I demanded before continuing. From her side, her mother had recognized her, handed her formula and another woman's card, then left. No later explanation could erase what those minutes felt like to her. At some point that evening, after Evelyn had made the required calls and the immediate chaos had settled, Emma apparently sat on the edge of a borrowed bed with Noah asleep nearby. Evelyn later told me Emma had not cried when she arrived. She had answered practical questions. She had checked Noah's bottle. She had asked whether she could keep the diaper bag with her. She had wanted to know exactly where Noah would sleep. Only after Evelyn told her that nobody was taking him anywhere without explaining what was happening did some of the tension leave her shoulders. Even then, she stayed alert. Evelyn asked once who had given her the card. Emma did not answer. Not then. She looked down at it instead. I was still under another name, while my daughter held a piece of paper connected to the real me, and tried to decide whether what she had seen meant I had abandoned her too. Hours earlier, she had believed one thing with absolute certainty. Mom will come back. Now she had seen me before I came home. And I had walked away. That wound would wait for me. So would the truth about how she had reached that grocery store. I received the final confirmation just before I was required to return fully to the operational environment. It was brief. No emotional language. No reassurance beyond what had been verified. Both children are safe. I stared at those 4 words longer than I had stared at anything all day. They should have brought relief. They did, somewhere beneath everything else. But another question had already taken its place. My daughter had left a house containing her father and both grandparents carrying her 6-month-old brother. She had been too frightened to approach police. She had reached a grocery store hungry enough to give up her own food. And when authorities finally found her, something in what she told them made them hesitate to send her back. Both children are safe. The sentence changed shape in my mind. Safe from what? Then, slowly, it became something worse. Safe from whom? Safe from whom? That question followed me through the next 72 hours more faithfully than sleep did. By the time I received confirmation that Emma and Noah had been located, fed, assessed, and placed somewhere they would not be immediately returned to the same adults whose actions were now being questioned, the panic that had driven through me outside the grocery store had changed shape. Panic wants movement. It wants you to run, grab, call, demand, force the world back into alignment. What came afterward was colder. I knew my children were alive. I knew they were indoors. I knew Noah had formula, and Emma was no longer carrying him from storefront to storefront with an empty stomach. I did not know what had happened in my family, and I was not yet free to find out. That distinction became the center of the next 3 days. Later, Evelyn would tell me that Emma's first night with her looked nothing like what people imagine when they picture a child finally reaching safety. There was no collapse into sleep, no sudden relief strong enough to erase the hours before it. Safety reached Emma's body more slowly than it reached the paperwork. Evelyn had worked with families in crisis long enough not to mistake silence for calm. She gave Emma food without making her earn it with explanations. She made sure Noah was fed and dry. She placed ordinary things within reach: water, clean towels, a place to set the diaper bag, because children who have spent even a few hours believing basic needs are uncertain begin noticing where every resource is. Emma noticed all of them. She also noticed the formula. Evelyn told me much later that after Noah finished a bottle, Emma checked how much remained in the can before she touched the food prepared for her. That detail stayed with me. Not because it was dramatic, because it was automatic. Less than 1 day had been enough for my daughter to learn to measure whether her brother had enough before deciding whether she was allowed to need anything herself. When Noah cried that first evening, Emma stood before Evelyn could. She was moving toward him when Evelyn stopped her. Not sharply, just enough to make her pause. Emma apparently looked almost offended by the idea that someone else might respond faster. Evelyn reminded her that she was 14. Emma, exhausted enough that the answer came without teenage decoration, told her she knew. Evelyn looked at the child who had spent most of the day carrying an infant, rationing supplies, and avoiding the very people searching for her. "You've been acting 42. Emma almost smiled. Almost. That tiny moment mattered to me when Evelyn described it months later, because it was the first evidence I had that my daughter had not disappeared completely beneath what happened. Somewhere inside the child checking bottles and watching doors, the girl who used to keep score between Noah and Adrian was still there. She just was not ready to come back yet. I did not know any of that while it was happening. All I had was confirmation that the emergency process had worked, and a request of my own moving up through channels I normally trusted without needing to think about them. I wanted out, not at the scheduled end. Not after another meeting, another observation period, or another controlled transition. Immediately, the person handling the operational side did not dismiss the request. That was almost worse. If someone had simply told me no, I could have spent my anger on them. Instead, the situation was reviewed. The risk was explained to me in the plainest terms that could be given without turning my family emergency into an operational briefing. My children had already been placed inside a protected civilian process. Their physical location did not depend on me remaining undercover, but abruptly collapsing the identity I was using before the surrounding risk had been closed could create a link between that identity and my real family. The very thing I had avoided outside the grocery store. My team could move to the earliest safe exit. That window was 72 hours. I remember looking at the number and thinking how obscene it was. 72 hours is nothing when you are waiting for a flight. It is nothing when you are counting down to a weekend. It is 3 days when your daughter has just looked you in the face while asking strangers to feed your son. I pushed once more. I needed confirmation of one thing before I would agree to remain in place. I needed to know Emma and Noah would not simply be released back to Adrian because he was their father. The answer came through the proper people, stripped of reassurance and sentiment. Emma's account had raised an immediate safety concern. Child welfare personnel were involved. The circumstances of the departure and the discrepancies in the initial report were being examined. A temporary approved arrangement would keep the children away from an immediate return while that assessment continued. Only then did I accept the 72 hours. Only after the children were confirmed safe did I accept the 72-hour exit window. The reasoning was sound. They were protected. I had asked to leave, and an abrupt collapse of the cover could create a new risk around them. None of that made closing my eyes any easier. I kept seeing Emma's face. Not the dirt, not the carrier straps, not even Noah. Her eyes. That instant when recognition moved through them, and she waited for me to acknowledge what we both knew. There are professional skills that feel admirable until you are forced to use them against someone you love. I had trained myself to separate reaction from action, to hold the face I needed instead of the face I felt, to let information settle before deciding what it meant. Outside that grocery store, those skills had kept me from doing something that might have exposed Emma to more danger. They had also allowed me to look like a stranger to my own child. Both things were true. For the next 3 days, I worked inside that contradiction. The assignment narrowed around its ending. Controlled movements, handoffs, long stretches of waiting, and the discipline of behaving as though my private life had not ruptured. I answered what needed answering, went where I was expected, and avoided mistakes. Once, late on the second day, I read the same line on a page 3 times without absorbing it. My mind had returned to the grocery store. I placed my finger beneath the sentence, took one breath, and forced myself to begin again. From the outside, those 72 hours were repetition and control, a woman doing ordinary things under an ordinary name, while every instinct kept counting the miles to her children. What I did not know was that while I was waiting for permission to return to my own life, Adrian was still trying to preserve the version of it he had built. I learned that later through Helen's statement, through Simone and through the records created after Emma and Noah were found. The children being located did not end the planned intervention. Adrian folded the crisis into the argument he had already been making. My absence had upset Emma. Emma had challenged the adults, and her departure therefore proved my work had destabilized her. Thomas's order and Adrian's presence at the door vanished from that version. When the authorities treated Emma's account seriously, Adrian called that an overreaction to a teenager who had misunderstood an argument. He was frightened by then. I believe that. Not frightened enough to tell the truth, but frightened enough that the intervention changed. It was no longer only about making me see what my work had cost the family. Now Adrian needed me on his side before I heard Emma's version. That was why he did not cancel the meeting planned for my return. He needed it more. Thomas still wanted the intervention, because admitting his command would mean admitting that his authority had helped create the crisis. Helen's certainty had begun to fail once child welfare professionals took Emma seriously, but she still delayed choosing and told herself everything could be explained when I came home. She remained part of the intervention even after she knew enough to question it. Emma, meanwhile, knew something Adrian did not. She knew I had been there. Evelyn did not press her for details about the card. The authorities had enough to work with, without forcing Emma to explain a connection she clearly did not understand herself. But sometime, during the second evening, Evelyn asked whether Emma knew the woman who had given it to her. Emma looked toward Noah before answering. I know who she was, that was all. She did not say my name. She did not explain why I had behaved like a stranger. She could not have explained it, but she knew. That single fact changed what waited for me at the end of those 72 hours. From my side, I had spent the time believing I would need to explain why I could not acknowledge her. From Emma's side, the question was simpler. Why had her mother seen her and still walked away? No classified justification could erase how the event had looked to a 14-year-old. I knew that before Evelyn ever told me Emma had recognized me. I saw it in her face at the grocery store. Still, knowing she had named the recognition out loud made something tighten behind my ribs. I wanted to ask if she hated me. I did not. That question would have been about my comfort. Emma had already carried enough adult feelings. The proper time for mine could wait. The assignment ended quietly. The operational exposure around my cover was reduced to the level required for me to return to my real life, and I received the confirmation I had been counting toward since Saturday afternoon. I could go home. I had imagined that moment dozens of times over the previous 3 days. In none of those versions did I feel relief. What I felt was urgency sharpened by restraint. I received the minimum information I needed before leaving. Emma and Noah remained safe. The child welfare assessment was active. Adrian's initial report contained discrepancies. The authorities were already reconstructing the circumstances of the children's departure. No one gave me a conclusion. No one needed to. There was enough to know I was not returning to a simple misunderstanding. I had one decision left to make before I went: whether to call Adrian. The version of me that had left home on May 4th would have done it automatically. She would have called to say the assignment had ended, asked for an update, listened while her husband explained the crisis, and tried to solve everything before reaching the driveway. I stood with the phone in my hand and pictured that woman. She was efficient, prepared, trusting, and if I called Adrian now, I would give him something he did not yet have. Time. Time to learn what I knew. Time to adjust his story. Time to call Thomas and Helen. Time to decide which parts of the truth could be admitted without collapsing the rest. For the first time since I left, my inability to communicate was no longer his advantage. He believed I was coming home according to the schedule he had known all along. He did not know I had seen Emma. He did not know I knew. She had not planned to run away. He did not know I had already learned that the account given to authorities contained inconsistencies. I put the phone away. I would come home exactly when he expected me, nothing more. The drive back through Maryland felt stranger than any border I had crossed. Places that had belonged to my assignment gradually became places from my ordinary life again. A road sign I recognized. A shopping center Emma once complained had the worst parking layout in the county. A turn I had made hundreds of times without needing to think about it. The closer I came to home, the less familiar it felt. I had left 15 days earlier believing danger was something I prepared my family against from the outside. Now every mile pointed inward. I thought about the binder, the childcare, and the emergency number systems I had treated as proof that I could safely leave. They had existed exactly as planned. The failure was in the choices of the people inside them. My hand stayed steady on the wheel. I did not rehearse accusations. I did not decide what punishment anyone deserved. I still did not have enough verified information for that. I had one question I wanted answered before everything else. Would they tell me the truth if I gave them the chance? I reached my house late in the afternoon on Tuesday, May 19th, my expected return date. Exactly the date Emma had memorized. Exactly the date Adrian had been told through the emergency line. There were more cars outside than there should have been. Thomas's, Helen's, Adrian's. For a second, I remained seated. The house looked almost offensively unchanged. Same front steps. Same planter near the door. Same pale rectangle on the siding where Adrian had once promised to mount a light and never had. Nothing visible suggested that my 14-year-old daughter had left another house, carrying my infant son 3 days earlier. I picked up my bag and went inside. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not empty house silence. Waiting silence. Adrian was in the living room. My parents were there with him. No children. No Emma's shoes near the wall. No sound of Noah. 3 adults sitting in a room as though they had been expecting not a wife, daughter, and mother to return, but a defendant. The arrangement told me almost everything I needed to know about what they had planned before I even heard a word. Thomas sat rigidly forward. Helen's hands were clasped too tightly in her lap. Adrian stood when I entered. He looked tired. For one dangerous second, the sight of him reached backward into 16 years of marriage. The man asleep beside Noah's crib. The father cutting Emma's sandwiches into triangles. The husband whose hand had held mine before I left. Then I remembered my daughter outside a grocery store asking strangers for formula. I set my bag down. I did not tell them I had seen her. I did not ask why they had lied. I did not mention the police report. Not yet. Adrian seemed to read my silence as exhaustion. Maybe he thought it would make me easier to persuade. He drew a breath, looked once toward my parents, then back at me. We need to talk about what your job did to this family. Adrian's sentence settled into the room, as though he had rehearsed it enough times to believe repetition could turn accusation into fact. We need to talk about what your job did to this family. For 15 days, I had imagined coming home in 100 ordinary ways. Emma complaining that I had missed something at school. Noah heavier in my arms than when I left. Adrian angry enough to be distant, tired enough to forgive. My mother trying to feed me before asking where I had been. My father making one of his pointed comments about work and then changing the subject when I refused to take the bait. Instead, I came home to 3 adults sitting without my children. That absence was louder than anything Adrian said. I left my travel bag where I had set it beside the doorway. The strap had folded inward, the same way it always did when the bag was not fully packed. I noticed that detail because my mind had become very good at holding on to small, harmless things when the larger ones threatened to move too quickly. Adrian remained standing. Thomas sat forward with both forearms on his knees. Helen had not moved since I entered. Her fingers were woven together so tightly that the skin across her knuckles looked pale. They had prepared for a confrontation. What they had not prepared for was the possibility that I already knew something. I let them keep that mistake. Adrian began speaking again. He told me the previous 2 weeks had exposed problems in our marriage that could no longer be postponed. He described himself as carrying responsibilities alone, my parents as stepping in where I had not been available, and Emma as having become increasingly angry and unstable because of my absence. He did not say that he had reduced the childcare I arranged. He did not say he had known my return date. He did not say my daughter had spent Saturday carrying her baby brother through Montgomery County while police searched for her. He told the story from the position he had spent nearly 2 weeks building for himself, the person who had stayed. Thomas added his own version in shorter bursts. He said children needed consistency. He said families could not function if one adult disappeared behind the word confidential, whenever practical questions became uncomfortable. He had always liked words such as consistency because they sounded neutral even when used as weapons. Helen tried to soften both men. She said no one wanted to attack me. They only wanted me to understand how badly things had deteriorated. I watched her thumb rub against the side of her index finger. She had done that when I was a child whenever she wanted to say something and did not know whether speaking would make a situation worse. That movement told me more than her words. The room smelled faintly of coffee that had been sitting too long. Someone had opened the curtains, but the afternoon light made the house look washed out rather than warm. On the side table sat one of Noah's cloth toys, a soft gray elephant with one ear bent beneath itself. I looked at it while Adrian described my daughter's behavior. He said Emma had grown resentful, defiant, secretive. He said she had begun acting out because she could not handle my leaving. The language was almost clinical. That frightened me more than anger would have. A father whose daughter had just been missing with his infant son should have had fear clinging to him. Relief, shock, something uncontrolled. Adrian sounded like a man presenting a case. I did not challenge him. I needed to know how much of the story they had agreed on, so I asked the simplest question available. Where are my children? For the first time since I walked in, Adrian hesitated. Only a fraction of a second. Then he gave me the sentence he had already given the authorities. Emma ran away with Noah. I had known he might say it. Hearing it still changed something inside me. There was a specific cruelty in watching someone lie when the truth was standing fully formed behind your eyes. 3 days earlier, Emma had been in front of me with Noah strapped against her chest. She had been hungry enough to ask strangers for formula. I knew she had no phone. I knew child welfare personnel had treated her account seriously enough not to return her immediately to Adrian, and he had chosen the word ran, as if she had planned it, as if the direction had been hers. I did not correct him. Not yet. Adrian took my silence as permission to keep going. He said Emma had been increasingly difficult in the days before she disappeared. According to him, she had talked about leaving and had been angry at everyone. He presented Saturday as the culmination of that instability. A teenager already upset by her mother's absence finally lost control, took her baby brother, and left. He said he had not been in the room at the exact moment she walked out. That detail was new to me. I stored it. Thomas shifted. Not dramatically. His shoulders moved just enough to tell me he had heard something he did not entirely agree with. I looked at my father. His eyes avoided mine for the first time since I came home. Adrian continued. He emphasized that the important thing was the children had been found. He described the official safety response as though it had become unnecessarily complicated because Emma had said things while frightened and angry. No one mentioned what those things were. No one volunteered why child welfare professionals might hesitate to return a 14-year-old and a 6-month-old to their father. The entire intervention depended on me asking the wrong questions. Why was Emma angry? Why did she run away? What had my work done to her? They wanted every road to begin with me, so I started somewhere else. I asked Thomas what happened before Emma left. My father straightened. For a moment he seemed relieved to be asked something he believed he could control. He admitted there had been an argument. Emma had been disrespectful. She had accused them of twisting the truth about my absence. Thomas said he had told her to calm down and stop challenging adults who understood more than she did. His description became less precise as it moved toward the door. I asked what he said immediately before she went outside. He told me he did not remember the exact wording. That answer did not fit my father. Thomas remembered exact wording whenever exact wording made him look right. He had quoted arguments from 15 years earlier, as though a court reporter had been sitting in the kitchen. I did not point that out. I watched him instead. His jaw tightened. Helen moved beside him. She said the whole thing had gotten out of control. Thomas had been frustrated. Emma had been angry. Everyone assumed she would step outside, cool down, and come back. We thought she'd cool off and come back. The sentence entered the room quietly. Adrian turned toward her. Not fast enough to look panicked. Fast enough. I looked at my mother. She lowered her eyes. That one sentence damaged more of their story than anything I could have accused them of. If Emma had been planning to run away, why had they expected her back in 5 minutes? If she had been threatening to leave for days, why had 3 adults calmly assumed she was cooling off outside? And if the departure had been entirely Emma's idea, what exactly had happened that made my mother think there was something for her to cool off from? I did not need to say any of that yet. The questions existed now. Adrian heard them too. He began reframing Helen's words almost immediately. He said they had hoped Emma would reconsider whatever impulsive decision she was making. Teenagers could be unpredictable. The important point, he insisted, was that nobody intended for her to disappear. That part may even have been true. Intention was becoming the refuge of everyone in the room. Thomas had not intended for Emma to keep walking. Helen had not intended for silence to become complicity. Adrian had not intended for a family intervention to end with child welfare investigators asking questions. They kept reaching backward toward what they meant, as though meaning could erase what they did. I thought about the grocery store. Emma had not asked strangers for their intentions. She had asked them for formula. I turned back to Adrian. He was still trying to hold the conversation in the frame he had prepared. He said my absence had created conditions. None of them had been equipped to handle. He wanted me to stop focusing on isolated moments and look at the larger pattern. That phrase almost made me laugh. The larger pattern was exactly what I had begun to see. I asked when he had tried to contact me after Emma disappeared. Adrian said I had been unreachable. I asked again, more precisely, "When did you call the emergency number I left you?" Silence changed the shape of the room. It was the first question they had not prepared for. Adrian's eyes moved toward the kitchen, as though the answer might be written somewhere beyond me. Thomas looked at him. Helen stopped rubbing her thumb. Adrian said he had not believed the line would reach me quickly enough. He tried to make the explanation practical. Police needed immediate information. Emma needed to be located. There was no time to wait on some corporate process that had never promised direct contact. I let him finish. Then I asked whether the line had worked the last time he called it. His face changed, only slightly. But after years of marriage, I knew the difference between Adrian thinking and Adrian calculating. He knew I knew. He did not yet know how much. The record of his earlier call was one of the few pieces of the puzzle that existed independently of anyone's memory. He had contacted the line on May 7th. He had been told my assignment was valid and that my expected return remained May 19th. He could no longer pretend the emergency number was some untested scrap of paper I had left in a binder. He had tested it himself. I did not explain where I had learned about the call. I did not need to. I told him only what was already safe to say. "You knew I was coming back on the 19th. Thomas looked at Adrian. That was the first moment I saw my father's certainty loosen. Not collapse, just loosen. He had apparently believed some version of Adrian's claim that nobody knew how long I would be gone, or whether the assignment might extend indefinitely. My mother knew the date, because Emma had repeated it, but she had treated that as what I had told a child before leaving, rather than something independently confirmed. Adrian had allowed uncertainty to grow where he possessed certainty himself. He said the date did not change the damage caused by my being gone. He was no longer denying what he knew, He was trying to make it irrelevant. But the difference between fear and manipulation was precisely that he had possessed the return date while telling relatives he did not know whether I intended to come home. My phone vibrated in my bag. The sound was small. Everyone heard it. I did not reach for it immediately. Adrian had already begun turning back toward the intervention. He said the family could not continue living under conditions where he did not know my actual location. He described my professional boundaries as incompatible with marriage, and repeated that what happened to Emma proved the children needed a more stable arrangement. There it was. Adrian was still using Emma's suffering to strengthen the argument he had planned before she walked through the door. I needed to change. Disgust arrived as something colder than anger clarity. I picked up my phone. The message was from Simone. She had heard I was home. I did not respond in the room. I told Adrian I needed a minute and stepped into the kitchen, leaving all three of them behind me. The emergency binder was still where I had left it, not exactly in the same position. Someone had moved it closer to the wall. But the pages were intact. My handwriting was visible beneath the clear plastic cover. Emma's joke came back to me. Mom's apocalypse plan. I rested 2 fingers against the binder without opening it. There was something almost obscene about how prepared I had been. The systems had not failed. The people had chosen not to use them. I called Simone from the kitchen, far enough away that I did not have to perform the conversation for anyone else. She did not waste time with greetings once she heard my voice. The hesitation in her breathing told me she had been waiting to say something. Simone explained that Adrian had contacted her early in my absence. She had believed him then. He sounded overwhelmed. He told her he did not know where I was, and was not sure I planned to come back. I asked when. She gave me the date. The same evening as the emergency line confirmation. I closed my eyes. The timing formed a structure I could not dismiss. Adrian confirmed the assignment and return date, then told Simone he did not know if I was coming home. That version existed before Emma challenged him, before Thomas told her to leave, and before the missing child report. The story had been built first. The crisis came later. I thanked Simone and ended the call without asking her to do anything else. I did not need a crusader. I needed people to tell the truth about what they had actually heard. When I returned to the living room, the atmosphere had changed. Adrian knew I had spoken to someone. Thomas looked irritated by the interruption. Helen looked frightened by it. I sat down for the first time, not because I was tired, because I no longer needed to stand as though I might leave at any second. I asked Adrian when he first began telling relatives I might not return. He said he did not remember saying that. I told him Simone did. The muscles near his mouth tightened. He immediately tried to place the statement inside emotion. He had been frustrated. He had felt abandoned. He had not meant it literally. That might have protected the sentence as an expression of hurt. It did not protect the pattern around it. I still did not know every step, but the pattern was no longer a single argument gone wrong. Adrian knew the date and the emergency line worked. He had reduced childcare, helped build the intervention, and then given an official version of Emma's departure that removed the adults from its cause. Thomas tried to bring the conversation back to Emma's behavior. He said nothing changed the fact that she had walked away with a baby. I looked at him. That was the first time I felt close to losing control. The image came back instantly. Emma outside the grocery store, shoulders bent beneath Noah, asking strangers to feed him. I pressed my thumb against the edge of my wedding ring until the metal hurt. Pain gave me something clean to focus on. Then I said the sentence I had been holding since I entered the house. Emma didn't run away. No one moved. Adrian's eyes locked onto mine. Thomas's face hardened. Helen inhaled, and did not release the breath immediately. Adrian asked how I could possibly know that. I let the question remain unanswered. He was not entitled to every source simply because he demanded one. For years, that boundary had been the thing he hated most about me. Now it was the only thing keeping him from knowing how badly his advantage had already disappeared. I told them I knew enough to understand that the version given to me did not match the version other people had been given. I knew enough to know Adrian had a working emergency channel and chose not to use it when our children were actually missing. I knew enough to know Thomas had said something before Emma went outside that nobody wanted to repeat accurately, and I knew enough to stop having this conversation inside the family. That decision moved the problem out of the family room, where silence had protected Adrian's framing, Thomas's pride, and Helen's need for peace. I was done asking the same system to police itself. I did not threaten them with my work. I did not reveal what I had actually been doing. I did not tell Adrian that the woman outside the grocery store had been me. I told them the questions involving Emma and Noah would go through the child welfare and investigative process already underway. I would provide what I could through the proper channels. I would speak to counsel about the immediate family situation. There would be no private agreement where everyone softened their part in exchange for preserving the marriage. Adrian stood again. The movement was abrupt enough to make Helen flinch. He did not threaten me. He asked whether I was seriously willing to tear apart the family before I had even heard his side. The old version of me might have answered that question. She might have explained that I was not trying to destroy anything. She might have reassured him that I wanted facts before judgment. She might have spent an hour proving she was still reasonable enough to deserve cooperation. I no longer needed to audition for reasonableness. The children had already paid for that performance. I picked up my bag. Adrian stared at me. Thomas told me walking out would solve nothing. Helen finally stood but did not try to block me. I looked at the three of them and thought about what they had expected from this afternoon. A tired woman returning from a trip. A mother ashamed because her daughter had supposedly run away. A wife frightened enough by the crisis to accept whatever conditions her husband placed in front of her. They had expected me to enter the room knowing only the story they had prepared. That was the hidden power beneath the entire intervention. Information. They thought they owned it. I opened the front door. Then I looked back at them. You were all counting on me coming home blind. No one answered. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. The afternoon air was warmer than it had been when I left 15 days earlier. A lawnmower hummed somewhere beyond the next row of houses. Someone's sprinkler clicked rhythmically against a driveway. The neighborhood continued its ordinary life, while mine divided itself cleanly into before and after. I had spent the previous 3 days asking how Emma ended up outside. Now I understood the more dangerous question. The door had not created the problem. It had exposed it. Adrian and my parents had been building a version of me before Emma ever walked out of that house. They needed me to be the mother who left. They needed my daughter to accept that version. And when Emma refused, the conflict stopped being theoretical. She had seen something before I did. She had recognized that the adults around her were not simply angry with me. They were trying to decide the truth for her. Emma had spotted the plan, while I was still trusting the people who built it. I did not go back inside that house. Not that night. Once I left Adrian, Thomas, and Helen behind, there was only one place I wanted to be. And for the first time since May 16th, I was allowed to go there as myself. The drive to Evelyn's took less than 40 minutes. I remember almost none of the traffic. I remember red lights because they forced me to sit still. I remember checking my hands on the steering wheel and finding that I had wrapped my fingers around it so tightly, my knuckles had gone pale. I remember passing a pharmacy and thinking absurdly about the diapers I had stocked before leaving, as though somewhere in that aisle existed an explanation for how a family with drawers full of baby supplies had allowed a 14-year-old to end up rationing them on a sidewalk. The address was not secret, and Evelyn was not hiding my children. Her status as an approved emergency respite caregiver gave the temporary arrangement a lawful basis, while child welfare and law enforcement personnel sorted through the adults' accounts. It was an ordinary home in a quiet neighborhood, a lamp burning beside a front window, and a competent adult who understood that children in crisis did not need the adults around them to make the crisis feel larger. I sat in my car for almost a minute before going to the door. 3 days earlier, I had seen Emma and been required to act like a stranger. Now I had no cover between us. That should have made the next step easier. It did not. The question had changed. Outside the grocery store, I had been afraid of what would happen if I showed her I was her mother. Now I was afraid of what would happen when I did. Evelyn opened the door after I knocked. I had spoken with her only through limited channels since the children were located. This was the first time I saw her in person without the grocery store chaos still surrounding everything. She was smaller than I had imagined, gray threaded through dark hair, reading glasses hanging from a cord against her chest. Her expression did not perform sympathy for me. I was grateful for that too. She stepped aside. I entered. The first thing I heard was Noah. Not crying, making the soft, repetitive sound he used when he had discovered something within reach and believed it required serious investigation. He was on a blanket, on the living room floor with a fabric ring in one hand. For 15 days, I had remembered his weight instead of feeling it. Now he was less than 15 feet away. My body moved before I consciously decided to cross the room. Then I saw Emma. She was sitting on the far end of the couch with her knees drawn slightly inward, one of Evelyn's blankets folded beside her. Clean clothes, clean hair, no carrier digging into her shoulders. She looked more like my daughter than she had outside the store. That made the distance between us worse. Emma stood when she saw me. She did not run to me. I stopped. There are reunions people understand instinctively, because we have seen them so often. The parent opens their arms. The child crosses the room. Both cry. Whatever happened before becomes secondary to the fact that they are together again. Emma gave me no version of that scene. Her arms stayed close to her sides. Her face barely changed. Noah recognized me first. He made a short, excited sound and kicked one leg against the blanket. That almost undid me. I crouched beside him instead of forcing Emma to decide what to do with me immediately. Noah grabbed at my sleeve, then my wrist, then the edge of my hair when I leaned close enough. His fingers closed with the indiscriminate confidence babies have in people they trust. I pressed my face briefly against the top of his head. Warm skin, baby shampoo, the smell of formula, 3 things that had existed in my house less than 2 weeks earlier and had somehow become proof that I had made it back to my own life. When I raised my head, Emma was still standing. She looked at me the way she had outside the grocery store. Not uncertain anymore. Certain. That was harder. You saw me. There was no accusation in the volume of her voice. She did not need one. I stood slowly. I did. Her jaw tightened. You knew it was me. I did. She looked past me toward Noah for a second, as though looking directly at my face required too much effort. And you walked away. I could have begun with all the reasons. I could have explained the active cover, the operational risk, the cameras, the emergency protocol, Evelyn, the liaison, the confirmation that she and Noah were safe. All of those things were true. All of them would have sounded like a mother trying to win a case against her own child, so I told her the part I could not argue with. I did. The silence afterward lasted longer than any explanation would have. Emma's fingers worked once against the seam of her sleeve. I told her there had been a reason I could not call her name where I found her. I told her that showing anyone nearby that she belonged to me could have created a connection I did not yet know was safe. I explained that after I left her sight, I had immediately activated help and had not continued until I knew she and Noah had been located and protected. I kept the explanation simple and limited to what Emma needed to understand. Emma listened without interrupting. What I needed her to know was not that I had been right. It was that I knew being right about the danger did not change what she had experienced. You saw your mother, I told her, and then you watched her leave. I know what that looked like. Her eyes filled before her face changed. She blinked hard. I did not move toward her. That was one of the hardest choices I made that night. Every part of me wanted to close the distance, but love does not automatically grant permission to touch someone you have hurt. Emma sat back down. I took the chair across from her rather than the couch. Noah remained on the floor between us. For a while, he became the only person in the room behaving normally. He chewed the fabric ring, dropped it, found one of his feet. Lost interest in the foot. Babies are merciful that way. They refuse to respect the emotional importance adults assign to a room. Emma began with the phone she had left charging on Grandma's kitchen counter. The detail mattered to her because it proved something she had never expected to need to prove. She had not planned to leave. From there, the memory came in physical pieces. The carrier straps, Helen telling her to put Noah down, and finally, the moment she looked at Adrian. That part made her stop. I had already known from the reconstructed timeline that Adrian was present. Hearing what his presence meant to Emma was different. She told me she had expected him to take Noah, not rescue her, not defend me, just take his son and end the absurdity of what was happening. He had not moved. Emma looked at her hands while she described it. I watched her thumbnail scrape once against her palm. Emma did not know whether Thomas meant the porch or the property line. She only knew he told her to go wait for me, and at first she obeyed, expecting someone to follow. That was the part I had not understood from the official timeline. By the time no one came, returning felt tangled with humiliation and fear. Later, when she saw police, Adrian's earlier warning about being separated from Noah took over. She would not risk her brother on another adult, saying, "Trust me." I kept my hands flat against my thighs. I did not interrupt to tell her Adrian had lied. She knew that now. The important thing was that she had not known it then. She remembered the cruiser, the diaper bag, the shrinking formula, and the money she was afraid to spend on herself. She did not tell any of it as bravery. To her it had been arithmetic, until she reached the grocery store and had to decide what kind of help she could risk asking for. Then she saw me. Emma looked up. That was the point where her voice changed. Not louder, thinner. She told me she recognized me, before she was completely sure she recognized me. Something about my eyes, something about the way I held the formula can. She had thought for 1 second that everything was over. Mom was here. Then I spoke to her like a stranger. I felt my throat tighten. Still, I let her finish. Emma said she almost called my name. She did not because my face frightened her, not because I looked cruel, because I looked controlled. She had never seen me look at her that way. That was the part no operational explanation had prepared me to hear. The expression I had used to keep her safe had looked like emotional absence to the child who knew my face better than anyone. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees. There were a dozen things I wanted to tell her. Instead, I said the one that mattered. That wasn't because I didn't want you. Emma's eyes moved to mine. I told her I had wanted to take her and Noah with me so badly that walking away had felt physically wrong. I told her the only reason I did it was because I believed exposing the relationship in that place could make the situation more dangerous. Then I told her something I had not said to anyone else. If I had known what you would think when I turned around, I still may have had to make the same choice. Her face tightened. I did not soften the sentence. But I would never pretend that means it didn't hurt you. That was the line between explanation and excuse. I could live with her anger. I could not ask her to erase it, so I could feel like a good mother again. For the first time since I entered the room, Emma cried openly, quietly. No dramatic collapse. Tears ran down her face while she looked furious about them. I moved only when she reached toward me. That movement was small enough another person might have missed it. Her hand shifted across the cushion, her fingers opened once. I crossed the space then. Emma leaned into me with the stiff reluctance of someone who still had unanswered questions but no longer wanted the distance. I held her, not as proof we were repaired. We were not. I held her because she had been 14 for every second of those 3 days, no matter how many adult responsibilities she had carried. Noah began complaining from the floor. The sound interrupted us before emotion could become something too polished. Emma pulled away first and wiped her face with the heel of her hand. I reached for Noah. He immediately got a fistful of my hair. I tried to loosen his fingers without making him angrier. He responded by pulling harder, making a delighted noise, and then spitting up a small amount of formula directly onto my shoulder. For 1 second, no one reacted. Then Emma laughed. It escaped her. A single sharp sound she clearly had not intended. I looked down at the wet mark on my shirt, then at Noah, who appeared extremely satisfied with himself. Emma covered her mouth. That made me laugh too. Not because anything was funny enough to deserve it. Because my son had just ignored 3 days of terror, a damaged marriage, an active investigation, and every adult's need for the moment to carry symbolic weight. He had simply thrown up on his mother. Emma's laugh broke halfway through and became another sob. She leaned against me again. This time I let both things exist. The crying, the ridiculousness, the fact that healing rarely arrives in the correct emotional category. Later that evening, Evelyn and I spoke privately while Emma stayed with Noah. She filled in what she had observed without trying to diagnose my daughter from a few days of crisis. Emma had slept lightly. She positioned herself where she could hear Noah. She checked supplies more than necessary. She watched doors. When someone else fed him, her attention remained fixed on the bottle until she was satisfied he had enough. None of those behaviors meant Emma would always be that way. They meant her body had not yet learned that the emergency was over. Evelyn advised me not to treat competence as recovery. That sentence stayed with me. Adults had already praised Emma too much for being capable. She was so good with Noah. So mature. So responsible. Every compliment risked reinforcing the idea that her value came from how little help she required. I had contributed to that before I left. Not intentionally. I had trusted Emma because she was dependable. I had sometimes smiled when she handled one of Noah's small needs before I reached him. I had thought I was making her feel included. Now, I saw how quickly inclusion could slide into responsibility when the adults around her stopped carrying their share. That was one of the blind spots I had to own. There were others. Adrian's resentment had not begun in May. Thomas's judgment of my work was not new. Helen's belief that motherhood should be measured by sacrifice had been part of my childhood. Emma had asked small questions before I left. Why Dad was so annoyed about the trip. Why Grandpa kept saying I should be home more. Why Grandma always told stories about what mothers gave up. I had answered each one separately. Stress, generational differences, marriage tension, ordinary family friction. I had treated the cracks as unrelated because the alternative was more frightening. The alternative was admitting that the people I trusted with my children might stop being safe when I was not there to mediate them. Preparation had become my excuse. I had a binder, a schedule, a backup plan, an emergency number. I mistook infrastructure for trustworthiness. Emma was interviewed through the appropriate child-sensitive process, without me beside her shaping the account. Police and child welfare personnel compared her statement with Adrian's report, the call timing, and the adults' separate accounts. The process was slow, but Emma's statement remained hers, and its strength came from the places where independent sources began to meet it. The most important question came from an investigator while I was present for a separate portion of the process. They had already established that Emma saw law enforcement during the hours she was missing and avoided them. That behavior needed an explanation. The investigator asked carefully whether Emma had previously expressed fear that authorities would separate her from Noah. I knew immediately where the question was going. Emma had already told me. Still, hearing it placed inside the formal reconstruction made the manipulation feel different. This was no longer merely a cruel thing Adrian had said during a family argument. It had changed my daughter's behavior during an emergency. The investigator looked down at the notes, then asked the question that shifted the entire case again. Who told Emma the police would take her brother away if she asked for help? I did not answer for my daughter. I did not need to. The question itself showed what the investigators had begun to understand. Emma had not avoided help because she was naturally reckless. Someone had taught her to fear it. That night, after the interviews and explanations and careful adult questions finally stopped, Noah cried from the room where he had been sleeping. Emma moved before I did. Her shoulders lifted. One foot was already beneath her. I stood. "I've got him." Emma froze. For a moment she watched me, as though giving me responsibility required a decision. Then she sat back. I went to Noah. He needed almost nothing. A bottle, a fresh diaper, a few minutes against my shoulder. Ordinary baby work. When I returned, Emma was still awake. But she had not followed me. She had not checked whether I warmed the bottle correctly. She had not counted what remained. She had let me be his mother, without standing guard over me. It was a tiny thing. It felt enormous. My phone vibrated on the table. Helen's name appeared on the screen. I almost let it stop. Then I remembered the way her hands had been twisted together in my living room, the sentence she had let slip about, expecting Emma back in a few minutes, and the fact that fear had finally begun to compete with her need to keep everyone calm. I answered. My mother did not ask me to forgive her. She did not ask whether I would bring the children home. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered it. I need to correct what I told them. My mother's decision to correct her statement did not repair anything. It changed the evidence. Those were not the same thing. By the next morning, Helen had spoken again with the people reconstructing what happened on May 16th. I was not in the room when she did it. I learned the substance afterward through the investigation and, later, from my mother herself. This time, she stopped trying to make every adult sound a little less responsible than they had been. Thomas had told Emma to leave. Adrian had been standing there. Noah had been strapped against Emma's chest. Everyone had seen him. And after Emma walked through the door, they had expected her to return within minutes because nobody in that room believed she had arrived that morning intending to run away. The admission was simple. Its consequences were not. For days, the family version had depended on a particular sequence. Emma had become increasingly unstable because I was absent. She had decided to leave. She had taken Noah with her, and the adults had been caught off guard. Helen's corrected account reversed the direction of cause and effect. Emma had not arrived with a plan. The adults created the moment that sent her outside. Then they allowed the moment to become a disappearance. Then Adrian described the disappearance as though Emma had created it herself. That did not answer every criminal question, but it broke the family version before any court decided what the law would do with the facts. For the first time, nobody could smooth the event into a phrase like teenage rebellion without colliding with another person's account. Thomas reacted exactly as I would have expected him to. He did not completely deny what Helen said. That would have required calling his own wife a liar. Instead, he reduced it. He insisted he had told Emma to step outside and cool off, not disappear. He said no reasonable person would interpret an angry grandfather's words as permission to wander through Montgomery County carrying an infant. He returned again and again to what he had meant, as though intention could reach backward through the door and change what a 14-year-old heard. Eventually, one sentence escaped the careful version he had been trying to construct. I told her to cool off. I didn't mean disappear. I was not there when he said it to investigators, but I read the summary afterward. The sentence looked almost harmless on paper, but it admitted the fact he had tried to soften. He had directed Emma away. Thomas still needed to cast himself as the authority whose instruction had merely been misunderstood, and that pride made a complete denial impossible. This time his words sat beside dates, witnesses, and a police report. Definitions were no longer his alone to control. Adrian's problems were worse. The word runaway was not the issue by itself. The material statements around it were. Adrian had said no adult instructed Emma to leave, and that he was not present when she did. Helen, Thomas, and Emma contradicted both claims. His allegation that Emma had threatened to run beforehand found no support in her phone, the school record, or any credible witness. The May 7th emergency line record also showed he knew I had a valid assignment and a confirmed return date. No single fact carried the case, but together they showed how consistently his version removed responsibility from the adults and placed it on Emma. That was the part he struggled to answer without returning to me. My work, my absence, my secrecy. He kept trying to make those things the beginning of the timeline. The investigators kept beginning on Saturday morning. That difference mattered. I could be an imperfect wife. I could have a career my husband resented. I could have failed to recognize warning signs before I left. None of that changed who stood in my parents' house when Emma was told to go. None of it changed who watched her carry Noah through the door. None of it changed who waited before reporting her missing. And none of it changed the facts Adrian gave police once he finally called. For almost 2 weeks, Adrian had benefited from making every discussion about whether I was a good enough mother. The official process did not need to answer that question before examining his conduct. I think that was when his control over the story truly began to collapse. Simone's account added something narrower than physical evidence, but still important. After confirming my assignment and return date, Adrian had told her he did not know whether I intended to come home. She also remembered him repeatedly presenting himself as the parent who stayed. Her testimony did not prove a crime. It showed that the abandonment story existed before Emma disappeared. Saturday gave Adrian an event to attach to a version he was already telling. The reduced childcare, my parents' exhaustion, the pressure on Emma, and the planned intervention finally resolved into one design I came to think of as Adrian's family reset. He wanted me to return to a family already convinced that my work and secrecy had caused the damage, then accept his conditions. Stop taking assignments that removed me from his reach, give him access to my locations, and surrender more control over family decisions, or separate under a story in which I had chosen work again. His goal was control over the shape of our life, not an asset he could take from me. For years, Adrian had lived beside a boundary he could not cross. He could ask where I was going, and sometimes the answer stopped at what my work permitted. He could know I was safe without knowing where I slept. He could know an assignment existed without knowing what sat beneath the cover. At first, he had tolerated that because it was part of the woman he married. Then he began to experience it as a verdict on his importance. After Noah was born, he decided the existence of the baby should settle the argument in his favor. When it did not, resentment became entitlement. If I would not voluntarily become the version of a wife he could fully understand and predict, he would create conditions that made staying myself too expensive. He wanted to force me back into the family on terms he controlled. Emma became collateral damage when she refused to confirm the story required to make those terms look reasonable. Once I understood that, the grocery store changed again in my memory. Emma had not been expelled because she was unwanted. She had been expelled in a moment of anger because she would not cooperate with a version of reality the adults had become invested in. And what made the adults responsible was not simply Thomas losing his temper. It was what happened after the door closed. They had opportunities. Minutes first, then an hour, then police questions, then the days after she was found. At each stage, telling the full truth became more expensive. At each stage, they chose delay, minimization, or distortion instead. The legal consequences began with review rather than spectacle. Prosecutors examined the departure, the delay, the adult supervisory roles, and Adrian's statements. Child welfare findings developed separately, while my attorney handled the civil side. The immediate priority was not the fastest punishment. Emma and Noah needed predictable rules about contact, supervision, and who could be trusted with them while the investigation continued. Temporary family court orders restricted Adrian's unsupervised parenting time while the safety questions were evaluated. The process moved more slowly than emotion did, and I had to learn to live at the speed of evidence. Thomas faced his own scrutiny because the incident occurred while he had accepted responsibility for helping supervise the children in his home. His command to Emma, Noah's presence, and his failure to immediately correct what had happened were considered as part of that review. Helen was different. Helen's moral responsibility was enormous to me, but the law did not need to convert every failure of courage into a criminal charge. She had witnessed the argument, waited, softened what happened, then eventually corrected the account. Whatever prosecutors decided, I could still set boundaries. Helen would not be alone with my children. Thomas had not earned my trust, and Adrian did not need to be sentenced before I could end the marriage. My lawyer began the separation and custody process. Nothing happened overnight. There were filings, temporary arrangements, evaluations, and schedules that made grief feel bureaucratic. There were days when a page of legal language seemed to contain less truth than one sentence Emma had said in my parents' den. Mom didn't abandon us. But the slowness had value. It prevented any of us from replacing one family narrative with another, just because the new one felt more satisfying. The record had to stand on its own. Outside the formal process, the social collapse moved faster. Simone was one of the first relatives to apologize to me. She did not excuse herself by saying Adrian was persuasive. She admitted she had accepted his framing because it fit an easier story: overworked husband, distant wife, baby at home, grandparents stepping in. Nothing in that version had required her to ask why I would supposedly disappear while leaving behind a precise return date and an emergency contact. Other relatives reacted differently. Some called. Some sent messages I did not answer immediately. A few stayed defensive and suggested there had to be blame on both sides. They were not entirely wrong. There were failures in my marriage before I left. There were conversations Adrian and I should have had more honestly. I had normalized warning signs, but shared marital failure was not the same thing as shared responsibility for what happened to Emma. I stopped allowing people to blur those categories. There was no campaign to expose them. People learned pieces of the truth through the consequences they could see. Adrian was no longer living the role of unquestioned, stable parent. Thomas was no longer automatically trusted with his grandchildren. Helen could no longer tell family members she was merely keeping the peace without someone remembering what that peace had cost. The punishment was quieter than spectacle. That made it harder to dismiss. My father felt the social change most visibly. Thomas had always occupied the place at family gatherings, where people deferred to him without consciously deciding to. He chose restaurants, settled minor arguments, gave advice nobody had requested. Younger relatives brought him problems because he projected certainty. After May, certainty stopped looking the same on him. People did not confront him dramatically. They simply stopped surrendering decisions. Simone once asked someone else for advice while Thomas was sitting at the same table. He noticed. Helen told me later he barely spoke for the rest of the evening. I took no pleasure in that particular detail, but I understood its justice. Thomas had wanted authority without the possibility of being corrected by a child. Now the people around him had seen what happened when his authority went unchallenged. Adrian experienced the collapse differently. He kept trying to pull me back into the original argument. Even while lawyers handled the civil process and investigators compared statements, he wanted to know what my work really was. He seemed to believe the hidden information would somehow explain everything. If he could finally prove I had been doing something unusually dangerous, unusually secret, or unusually important, perhaps he could justify why he had felt entitled to force the boundary open. Or perhaps he thought discovering the truth would give him one last piece of me. During one of the limited exchanges related to the children, he asked again, not where I had been on the commercial paperwork, not what my employer had verified. What had I actually been doing? By then, the necessary parts of my employment status had been confirmed through appropriate channels for the legal process. There was no legitimate need for Adrian to know more. For 16 years, I had carried guilt every time that boundary hurt him. I understood why. A marriage built around incomplete information requires trust that other couples may never have to practice. Adrian had once given me that trust. I had once believed the discomfort it caused him was a cost we had both freely accepted. Somewhere along the way, he stopped seeing it as a boundary and started seeing it as a humiliation. He wanted the answer one more time. I looked at the man I had married at 22 and understood something I could not have understood then. Love did not convert access into a right. Marriage did not mean every locked door belonged to your spouse. And being hurt by someone's boundary did not give you permission to break other people until the boundary disappeared. Something you still don't have the right to know. I watched the answer land. There was no triumphant music in my head. No thrill of finally winning. Only the strange relief of saying the same truth I had said throughout our marriage, without apologizing for its existence. Adrian had spent weeks trying to make my secrecy the villain of our family. In the end, the thing that destroyed his position was not what I had kept secret. It was what he had done in plain sight. The legal process would continue for months. Statements would be tested. Charges would be evaluated. Parenting arrangements would be decided by people who had no interest in our family mythology. For the first time since May 4th, I no longer feared that truth depended entirely on my ability to prove it in one dramatic moment. It was already distributed across too many independent places to be put back inside Adrian's version. Emma remembered the door. Helen remembered expecting her back. Thomas remembered telling her to cool off. Simone remembered what Adrian had said before any crisis existed. The emergency line had a date. The police report had Adrian's words. One piece could be minimized. Together they could not all be explained away. The story they had built could survive inside a family room where everyone agreed not to look too closely. It could not survive daylight. That should have felt like an ending. It did not, because by then I had learned that proving my daughter had told the truth was not the same thing as giving her back what the lie had taken. Emma was home with me under the temporary arrangements we had built around the investigation. Noah slept in his crib again. The refrigerator had formula, her phone charged beside her bed. There were adults she could call, whose names she knew in advance. All the practical pieces had returned. Emma still checked them. She checked whether there was enough formula before I went shopping. She checked what time I expected to be back from a short appointment. She glanced toward Noah's room when voices rose on television. If a door closed too hard somewhere in the house, her shoulders changed before her face did. No court order could erase that. No prosecutor could sentence Adrian to return the exact version of Emma who had existed on May 4th. I had spent the first half of this story trying to understand how my daughter ended up outside a grocery store. Then I spent weeks understanding why the adults around her had allowed it to happen. The harder question was waiting after both answers. What did safety look like to a child who had learned how quickly adults could rename danger? I knew how to build protocols. I knew how to verify facts. I knew how to create backups for emergencies. I had already done all of that once. What I did not yet know was whether Emma could ever stop preparing for the next failure. Justice was beginning to tell her that what happened was wrong. I still had to teach her something more difficult. That being safe did not mean she had to stay ready all the time. By February of the following year, the story people had once told about me had become almost unrecognizable. Not because I had replaced it with a cleaner one, because time had done what arguments could not. It had separated choices from excuses. 9 months had passed since the morning Emma walked out of my parents' house with Noah against her chest, long enough for statements to be compared more than once, long enough for lawyers to stop speaking in temporary language, long enough for Adrian's first report to be examined beside the people who had actually been in the room, long enough for anger to lose some of its heat and leave behind the parts that mattered. The criminal case did not end with Adrian dragged out of our house in handcuffs. There was no perfect scene where someone read his lies aloud and a room full of people gasped at exactly the right moment. Real consequences arrived through appointments, filings, interviews, negotiations, and dates printed on documents. Adrian eventually resolved the criminal case through a guilty plea on charges supported by the evidence gathered around the children's neglect and the materially false statements he had made to law enforcement about Emma's departure. The exact legal language mattered to the court. What mattered to me was simpler. For months, he had insisted that Saturday happened because everyone misunderstood him. The record eventually required him to accept that some of what he had done was not misunderstanding, it was choice. The court imposed consequences appropriate to those offenses, along with conditions that would follow him beyond the day the case officially closed. I did not sit there hoping for the longest possible punishment. By then I had learned how little satisfaction comes from measuring justice only in years, months, or restrictions. The consequence that mattered most to my children was immediate and practical. Adrian no longer controlled when he saw them. His parenting time remained limited and supervised under the family court arrangements, while the safety concerns and his conduct were evaluated. He could not simply arrive at school, collect Emma, take Noah for a weekend, or turn parental status into automatic access. For someone who had spent months trying to prove he was the stable parent, losing the ability to define stability for himself cut deeper than anything I could have said to him. At first, he fought the language of every restriction. He objected to supervision as though it were an insult rather than a safeguard. He wanted wording changed. He wanted the record to distinguish what he intended from what occurred. His attorney handled those objections where they belonged. I stopped allowing them into my home, my phone, and the hours I spent with my children. That boundary was part of my recovery, too. For years, I had treated Adrian's discomfort as a problem I needed to help solve. By winter, I could let him be uncomfortable without rushing to make myself responsible for it. Thomas's legal outcome developed separately. His part had never been identical to Adrian's, and I refused to pretend it was simply because equal punishment would have made the ending feel neater. My father had not built the entire narrative. He had not called the emergency line, then hidden what he knew from relatives. He had not made Adrian's false statements to police, but he had accepted temporary responsibility for my children. He had told a 14-year-old carrying a 6-month-old baby to leave his house. He had watched the door close. He had waited. And when the situation became serious enough that telling the truth would embarrass him, pride made honesty harder than it should have been. The legal process treated those facts as his, not Adrian's. His case eventually produced consequences tied to the neglect that occurred while the children were under his supervision. The outcome was less severe than Adrian's, but it was not nothing, and it did not restore him to the place he believed he naturally occupied in the family. That second consequence turned out to be the one Thomas understood most clearly. He lost unquestioned authority. No court had to issue an order declaring that. It happened in kitchens, living rooms, and family decisions. People stopped treating his certainty as evidence that he was right. When someone needed advice, they no longer automatically looked to him first. When a gathering involved Emma or Noah, no one assumed my parents would supervise because they were grandparents. Thomas could still speak. He could still have opinions. What he no longer had was deference. For a man who had once told my daughter she was too young to tell adults what was true, that loss carried its own symmetry. Helen's outcome was different again. She was not criminally charged merely because I wanted her held accountable. The evidence did not require the law to transform every failure of courage into a crime. I came to accept that without confusing it with forgiveness. My mother had watched Emma leave. She had told herself 5 minutes would fix it. She had watched Adrian shape the story afterward, and initially helped make it softer than the truth. Then, eventually, she corrected the record. Both things belonged to her. The correction mattered. So did how late it came. I set boundaries that did not depend on a judge giving me permission. Helen did not babysit. She did not pick Emma up from school. She was not left alone with Noah. Being their grandmother did not function as a key that opened every door. For months, she struggled with that more than she admitted. She had spent her entire life believing motherhood and grandmotherhood were identities that carried rights automatically because of the sacrifice inside them. Now she had to learn that love could exist without access, and regret could exist without immediate restoration. Sometimes she asked whether I thought I would ever trust her again. I stopped giving her timelines. Trust was not parole. I could not tell her 6 months, 1 year, or 5 good decisions. She would have to become safer whether or not a reward waited at the end. The divorce took longer than the family arguments had. That, too, was ordinary. There were financial disclosures, parenting questions, negotiations, and legal steps that no dramatic story could make meaningful simply by quoting them. Adrian and I had almost 16 years of marriage behind us. A court did not erase those years because the last one ended badly. By February, the essential shape of our separation had become permanent. The marriage that once held birthday breakfasts, school pickups, sleepless nights with newborns, and hundreds of ordinary Sundays was ending through the civil process it required. There was no single day when I woke up and felt unmarried emotionally. That happened in pieces. The first time I changed an emergency contact without discussing it with Adrian. The first time I made a decision about work without imagining how I would defend it to him. The first night I slept in a house where no one was waiting for me to justify why part of my life belonged only to me. The paperwork caught up later. What surprised me was how little triumph I felt. I had loved him. That remained true even after everything else became true. There were still mornings when I remembered him asleep beside Noah's crib before I remembered the police report. Sometimes Emma said something with the same dry timing Adrian used to have, and the recognition moved through me before I could stop it. Memory did not respect legal outcomes. I let that be complicated. Ending the marriage did not require me to manufacture a childhood for Emma, in which her father had never loved her. It required me to stop allowing the existence of that love to excuse what he did later. My work changed too, but the decision was mine. I did not resign in response to Adrian's coercion. I changed the parts I believed needed changing, because I was a mother, and because the crisis had exposed weaknesses I could no longer ignore. I redesigned the emergency structure, so no single spouse, parent, or relative could become the only gatekeeper again. Emma knew the safe adults by name, and understood what asking for official help actually meant. While Noah was young, I also accepted different assignment parameters, and adjusted what I was willing to take on. Those decisions belonged to me. I also stopped treating preparation like proof that nothing could go wrong. My old instinct was always to create one more layer, one more number, one more backup, one more page inside the binder. The new version of preparation began with people instead. Who would Emma trust if I was unreachable? Did that person know what to do? Did Emma understand the plan herself? Could one adult's fear or pride cut off the route to help? The binder became thinner. The network became stronger, Emma noticed. She noticed everything. Her recovery did not arrive in the steady upward line adults like to imagine for children. There were good weeks, followed by strange afternoons, when one small thing pulled her backward. She still checked formula sometimes. Noah had grown enough that we were gradually moving beyond the stage when every feeding depended on it. But if I opened the pantry and found 2 containers instead of 3, Emma noticed before I did. At first, she would ask when I planned to buy more. Later, she only glanced. Eventually, there were days when she did not look at the shelf at all. She still wanted exact return times. If I said I would be back around 4, she asked whether that meant before or after 4:30. I stopped teasing her about it. I gave her a time. Then I returned when I said I would. That was how trust rebuilt itself, not through speeches, through boring accuracy. I came back at 4:15, then 3:50, then 4:05. again and again, until my return stopped feeling like a test. She also reacted to arguments differently. For months, any raised voice made her attention shift toward Noah. Even a television scene could do it. Her head would turn before she seemed aware she had moved. I learned not to point it out. If Noah was safe, I let her see that without making her explain why she checked. Evelyn had been right. Competence was not recovery, so I stopped praising Emma for being able to manage Noah like a second parent. I thanked her when she helped, the same way I would thank any older sibling. Then I made sure helping ended. If Noah needed a bottle while Emma was doing homework, I got the bottle. If he woke early Saturday morning, I got up. If Emma wanted to spend 2 hours doing something pointless in her room while laundry accumulated outside the door, I let her be 14. That last part required more discipline than I expected. After everything she had done, there was a temptation to treat Emma like someone unusually mature. She was not. She was a teenager who had been unusually burdened. There was a difference. By winter, some of the ordinary problems returned. I began finding mugs in her room. She forgot to put one of Noah's toys back where she found it. She procrastinated on schoolwork and then complained that deadlines were unfair inventions created by people who hated happiness. The first time she slammed a cabinet because I told her she could not stay out as late as she wanted, I stood in the kitchen after she left and nearly smiled. Not because disrespect had become charming, because normal conflict had returned. She was angry with me as her mother, not afraid of me as an adult with power over whether she and Noah stayed together. That was progress. The biggest change happened so quietly, I nearly missed it. One Saturday in February, I decided we were going to a farmer's market. Nothing dramatic, no anniversary, no symbolic family trip. I wanted vegetables. Emma wanted something sweet from a bakery stall she liked. And Noah had reached the stage where any public place containing dogs became the greatest experience of his life. I had made a short list the night before. Parking, stroller, weather, extra diaper, snack, backup bottle. Emma found it on the counter. She stood there reading it while I packed Noah's bag. For a few seconds, I assumed she was checking whether I had forgotten something. That would have been consistent with the previous 9 months. Then, her mouth moved. Not quite a smile at first. You made a checklist for the farmer's market. I looked at the paper. In my defense, farmers' markets contained variables. That was what I told her. Emma stared at me with the expression she used to reserve for the most unreasonable statements adults could make, while believing they sounded intelligent. Then she shook her head. And there she is. Mom's apocalypse plan. My hands stopped inside Noah's diaper bag. Emma had already turned toward the refrigerator. She did not see my face. I was grateful, because for 1 second the kitchen from May 4th returned so completely I could almost hear Adrian sleeping beside the crib and Noah winning a battle he did not know he was fighting. The same counter. The same kind of list. My daughter making fun of me. Except 9 months had passed between those two jokes. 9 months in which Emma had been told her memory was wrong, sent through a door, left without a phone, made to believe asking police for help could cost her brother, forced to ask strangers for formula, forced to look at her mother and wonder why she was pretending not to know her. For months afterward, Emma's humor had appeared only in fragments. Now she had teased me without checking the room first. She had not measured whether the joke would make an adult angry. She had not softened it. She had simply found me ridiculous. I folded the list once and put it in my pocket. I did not tell her what the moment meant. That would have ruined it. We went to the market. Noah stared at every dog as though meeting celebrities. Emma bought something covered in enough powdered sugar to leave fingerprints on her jacket. I forgot one item on my list, and refused to admit that this weakened my defense of civilization. We came home carrying vegetables we did not need, bread that disappeared before dinner, and a small paper bag Emma insisted she had not been responsible for emptying. Nothing happened. That was the gift. For a long time, I had thought meaningful days announced themselves. The day a child was born, the day a marriage ended, the day police called, the day truth finally caught up with a lie. I had begun to understand that healing preferred ordinary days. Days when nobody had to be brave. That night, I checked the doors before bed. Once, not twice. Another habit I was teaching myself. Emma was already in her room. Noah had gone down after the usual fight against sleep, his resistance becoming less impressive every month. I stood beside his crib for a moment and watched his chest rise beneath his pajamas. He was older now than the baby Emma had carried through Montgomery County, but sometimes I still saw both versions at once. The infant on her chest, the child sleeping safely in front of me. I turned off the lamp and left the door partly open. Somewhere after midnight, Noah cried, not a frightened cry. The half-awake complaint of a baby who had lost whatever arrangement with sleep he thought he was entitled to. I woke immediately. For years, training had made me quick to surface from sleep. Now motherhood did the same thing. I pushed the blanket aside and stepped into the hallway. Emma's door was open a few inches. As I passed, I saw movement inside. She was awake. For 1 second, the old sequence returned. Noah cries. Emma rises. Emma checks. Emma makes sure everyone else is doing what they should. Her silhouette shifted beneath the blanket. I stopped without meaning to. Then I saw her head settle back onto the pillow. She had heard me. That was enough. I went into Noah's room. He stood holding the crib rail, deeply offended by the fact that night still existed. I lifted him, changed him, and settled into the chair beside the window. His body softened against mine slowly, one small hand opening and closing against my shirt until it finally went still. The house became quiet again. I looked toward the hallway. Emma did not appear. She did not check the bottle. She did not ask whether Noah needed anything. She did not stand in the doorway pretending she happened to be awake. She trusted that someone else had gotten up, that someone else would stay awake long enough, that if she closed her eyes, her brother would still be safe in the morning. I had spent a large part of my adult life being praised for staying calm when other people panicked, for noticing danger early, for carrying responsibility without showing how heavy it was. Emma had learned a version of those same skills. In one terrible day. People might have called her brave for it. She was brave. I just no longer wanted bravery to be the price of her safety. I carried Noah back to his crib. His hand opened when I lowered him, fingers releasing the fabric of my shirt without waking. I waited until his breathing settled. Then I passed Emma's room again. Her door remained slightly open. Inside, she was asleep, not pretending, not listening. Sleeping. 9 months earlier, my daughter had stood outside a grocery store with her baby brother against her chest and offered to go hungry so he would not have to. That image would never disappear from me. But it was no longer the last image. The last image was quieter. Noah safe in his crib, Emma beneath her blanket, and me awake in the hallway between them. For once, she did not have to keep watch. I did. And that was how I finally understood what safety was supposed to mean. Not raising a child strong enough to survive every failure around her. Building a life where she no longer had to.